think we will begin. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome in. Shalom. Charafna. It's certainly appealing to this panel. My name is Nir Bams of Tel Aviv University. I'm very privileged to be here and help moderate this panel. And we will do most of this panel in English. We may have some German comments. And therefore, if anyone needs headsets, you can have them. A simple way to take a measure of a country is to look at how many people want in and how many people want out. This is not my quote. This is something I borrowed from Tony Blair, but it might be an interesting prism to look at this subject and at these two countries, Germany and Israel. Two countries that in many ways and for many years have been absorbing immigrants. Israel have been doing this over 60 years before its establishment. Germany has been doing a lot of that as well, mostly a little later from the 50s. We are speaking about the phenomena and the term that we may touch base on later, guest workers, Gastarbeiter, if my German is correct. And as Max Frisch noted, we asked for workers, but we got people instead. And really, what we will try to speak about today is the challenge of integration and the challenge of immigration, the differences and the similarities associated with these challenges in the context of both Germany and Israel. In Germany, where some of these numbers I know are contested, but it appears that many of these Gastarbeiters have found a home from the 50s, naturally bringing with them a set of beliefs, set of values, sets of identities, and at times perhaps found themselves at odds with older and more established German norms. Estimate speaks about 16 million immigrants or people from immigrant backgrounds in Germany, out of which 4 million about are Muslims. In Israel, the Jewish state, the state that defines itself as a Jewish state, is a home to no less than 1.6 million Muslim Arabs, or 21%. This number in real terms, just to compare, is about a third of the numbers of Muslims in Germany. And I start with this introduction because on the one hand, the context of these two challenges is obviously very different. Right? In Germany, we speak mostly about an issue of integration, absorption. And in Israel, this issue of integration, when we speak about it, stands in the shadow of a much more complex internal tension, a tension between a state that defines itself Jewish and democratic, which by itself creates a tension, and certainly a tension that stands in the context of a much broader tension. Of course, I refer to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Nevertheless, it seems that the two situations also might be a bit more similar as they first appear. Because both Israel and Germany deal with this challenge of creating and maintaining a multicultural society. Israel absorbed immigrants from no less than 130 countries. Germany absorbed immigrants from over 60 countries. And both countries have developed models and programs that aim to deal with this challenge. So we have three distinguished speakers here who will hopefully help us to shed some light on some of the dilemmas and issues associated with this question of integration and immigration. And let me start with my colleague and friend from my right, Mohammed Daraouche. Mohammed is the co-chairman of the Abraham Fund initiatives. It's a peaceful coexistence between Israel's and Jewish and Arab communities is the aspiration of both the Abraham Fund initiative and also of Mohammed Daraouche himself, who is his deputy chairman. Prior to his current position, Daraouche was involved in the Jewish-Arab dialogue as deputy director general of the Givat Chaviva Institute, which is the oldest and biggest organization of its kind in Israel. Daraouche also has the roles of editor of the New Arabs in Israel magazine, and director general and campaign manager of the Arab Democratic Party, as well as the director of the Young Leadership Forum. Mohammed Daraouche became a member of the Tri-Sector Roundtable at the Prime Minister's Office in 2011. In 2008, he was elected as a council member of his hometown, Ixelles. He holds degrees in peace building and development from the American University School of International Service, as well as mediation from the Goma Institute. He is one of the prominent voices in Israel to speak often in the public on these issues. To his right, Ophir Paz-Pines, head of the Local Government Institute at my own university, Tel Aviv University. He's also the former Minister of Interior. Ophir Paz-Pines currently heads the Local Government Institute at Tel Aviv. He formerly served as the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Science, Culture, and Sport. He was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Cabinet. Following the 2006 Lebanon War, he quit the Olmert government and turned his energy toward the Knesset floor. In 2010, he resigned from the Knesset, and Pines Paz was the chairman of the Interior Environment Committee at that time. Responsibilities include the local government, citizenship, and religious affairs. He founded and chaired a committee on foreign workers, certainly something that is very relevant to our discussion. Additionally, he served as a member of various Knesset committees, including the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees, Immigration, and Absorption. To his right, Annette Kahana, he's the chairperson of the Amadeo Antonio Foundation. Annette was born in East Berlin. He is a Latin America specialist in the former German Democratic Republic. During her stint as East Berlin's first and only Foreign Affairs Ombudsman, she sent out warnings about the dangers of right-wing extremism, an issue that she continues to deal with until this very day. In 1991, she formed the Eastern German branch of the RRA Association, Centers of Education, Integration, and Democracy. And her role as a managing director of the association was to introduce intercultural education as well as to push through the democratization process in Eastern Germany school. She founded the Amadeo Antonio Foundation in 1998. She acted as a chairperson of its board of trustees. Since 2003, she's been a full-time chairperson. And the city of Berlin honored Annette's work by awarding the Moses Mendelssohn Prize in 2002. With that in mind, and excuse the long introduction, so let's get to the point. And let me first of all ask perhaps each of you to speak about one dimension, but the one dimension that you see as the most important one, that symbolizes the challenges of integration in both Israel and Germany.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to say I'm always humbled to speak with the presence of my professor, Shlomo Avineri, who was my professor of political science way back in the 80s. So it's always a bit difficult to speak when you're present. No, please stay. I'm proud that you were my professor. Second, I would like to thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for facilitating my attendance of this conference, which I think is extremely important, and especially when it puts these issues on the discussion. And if I connect your question to the topics that were discussed a bit earlier, clearly the theme of tension between the Jewish and democratic nature of the State of Israel, the balance that the State of Israel is trying to find in the last 65 years of how much Jewish and how much democratic it is, and to whom it's Jewish and to whom it's democratic. One of the Arab members of the Knesset said once that the State of Israel acts as Jewish towards the Arab citizens and as democratic towards the Jewish citizens. That was taking it to the extreme by saying that the state is not really behaving as fully Jewish and fully democratic to everyone. And if I relate to some of the topics that were presented before, and some of the speakers alluded to it earlier, everyone wants Israel to be a Jewish state. Everyone wants to be the state of the Jewish people. But friends, Nir just said Israel has 21% citizens that say it's their country also. And you know what? We did not immigrate to the country. That country immigrated to us. And that presents itself as a key issue of how would a country that came on an indigenous population will fit itself to suit that population at the same time. It defines itself also as an ethnic state that serves the ethnic nature of the Jewish people. Now let me just clear from the table, I do not question the issue of whether Israel should exist or not. Israel should exist as the homeland of the Jewish people. There's no question about this. At the same time, I say, I do want to see Palestinian state for the Palestinian people. There's no question about this. But in today's modern states, no one can claim or aspire for the creation of pure ethnic homelands when you talk about ethnic states or even nation states. Every state today is going to have a minority. That's the nature of the new era we live in, as you know, since people discovered airplanes and transportation, cross-cultural movement and transfer and settlement has become natural for people. Sometimes the minorities are created as a result of immigration to the country, or in the state of Israel by indigenous population that has lived before the creation of the state. So when you define democracy, democracy needs to be defined not only by the rule of majority, that's what Professor Avneri taught me in the 80s, but it's also by its capacity to engage the minorities in a way that we're not just talking about individual rights, we're not only talking about collective rights, but also about the ability of the minority to feel at home. I want Israel to be my home. I don't want to be a guest in Israel. And very often the state of Israel treats me as an Arab citizen as a guest, and you know what, sometimes even as a temporary guest, as if being not legitimate. So from one end, we see fantastic developments over the past few years in economic integration, in increased educational level of the Arab community, in services that are provided by the government, but still you see that the volume of these developments is very far from the volume of and the speed is very far from the speed of the progress of the Israeli Jewish population. The gaps are very often expanding, but we come to a situation today that almost 56% of the Arab citizens are below poverty line in Israel. If someone tells me this is democracy, you know what, maybe I should question democracy. I should question democracy that creates poverty rate of 56% in my community. If this is the meaning of a Jewish state, I should question that too. That's the failure of the Jewish state. That's the failure of the democratic state. That's the failure of the combination of Jewish and democratic. So when you speak about the state of Israel, I wanted normal Israel, a normal country that sees itself as the state of its citizens and the state of the Jewish people. When you say the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people, it does not exempt it from being the state of its citizens at the same time. This is the key point from my perspective.
So thank you for that, and perhaps perhaps let's Ophir respond to that, particularly as a former minister who has been responsible for this. Have Israel really failed?
Well, I'm not sure that I want to respond to that, because you said at the beginning that it's a free question. So are you going to stick with that? Because I wanted to talk about a different issue. But if you want me to respond on that, that's okay. So it's up to you. It's up to me? Or it's up to you? I wanted to talk about something completely different, which is also very interesting for me, and I believe also for you. We have a very sensitive debate these days in Israel about the Israeli Jewish immigrant to Berlin. Don't you think it's a very sensitive issue? So, to talk about that, with your permission. Okay. First of all, three preliminary remarks. Number one, you know that in Hebrew, the concept of immigration and absorption is not, in the Hebrew translation is a little bit different. We call it aliyah and klita. Aliyah and klita is not exactly immigration and absorption, at least we think so, because we believe that the whole concept of immigration in Israel, it's a little bit different than in other countries because of the way that we established the state of Israel and the law of return for Jews to the state of Israel and all this issue. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we believe that it's connected to values, to Zionism, to Jewish values, to Israeli values. So for many years, we are we have problems with Israeli Jews that lives Israel, that immigrants from Israel to a different country, what we call Yerida. And the third remark is, when you talk about Israeli-German relationship, we are talking about unique relationship, very unique relationship, and for us to understand that there is a phenomenon that Israeli Jews living Israel and choose to live in Berlin or in Germany is even more sensitive than just living Israel, which is sensitive enough. Even if you want to go to America or to Holland or whatever, wherever it's sensitive, and people in Israel see it as a kind of something that is not legit in a way. At least it was that's how we saw it before. But to leave Israel and go and live in Germany, that's even more problematic. So there was this TV show about that. I think Channel 10 were here. They spoke with the Israelis that lives here, and by the way, there are quite a number of people that lives here for a long time, for many years. And so what do we say about it? So after I said what I said, I would need to say another thing. I think that the real challenge that we have to face is how can we preserve the very unique relationship between Germany and Israel after the Holocaust, after the Shoah, after the World War II. But still, the challenge is to bring it and to try to have also a normal relationship that respond to the present challenges and to the future challenges. And because I think that we know, I think that we should know, and we know that the world is a global world these days. We have to, even though I would like my children, and thank God they're still living in Israel, and I would like them to live in Israel forever, I have to acknowledge the fact that there are some Israelis that for various of reasons decide not to live in Israel and to live outside of Israel, for professional reasons, for educational reasons, for cultural reasons, for business reasons, for partnership reasons, you name it. And we have to admit that a large amount of Israelis lives outside of Israel. Some would say more than 1 million people all around the world. And I think that we have to acknowledge that, we have to understand that, and we have to live with it. We have to live with it. Israel should, and the way to handle this is to try and continue the efforts to make Israel a better country. It is a good country. I think it's a very good country, but the challenge is to make it even better in all fields, including, by the way, in the field that Muhammad talked about. I think that we have to narrow and close many gaps that exist between the Arab population of Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel, and the Jews in Israel. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to understand that, and we have to try and narrow the gaps and close the gaps and create a country that is, on one hand, the country of the Jewish people, but on the other hand, the country of its all citizens. That's the main challenge. That's one of the main challenges that we have to face, and we have to do more on that field. And we have to make Israel as attractive as we can in order to keep our citizens in Israel and give them all the opportunities that they need for the future, and to bring back all those that chosen not to live among us and give them a better future in Israel. It's one of our tasks, and I hope that we'll be able to overcome it.
Just to fear, but still, I'll try to be less democratic here and do a quick follow-up already. Do you agree with what Muhammad had said before, that Israel is democracy for the Jews and Jewish for the Arab? Or do you agree that Israel, in that sense, had failed? Or do you have somebody who has been involved in dealing with these issues, perhaps another perspective on some of that?
Well, I think that we didn't succeed, and maybe we didn't try enough to give the Arab citizens of Israel the feeling that they are equal. And I have to admit, and I've been in service, in public service. I was, as you said, Minister of Interior and in other positions. And I have to admit that there are many problems on that field. It connected, of course, to the conflict. It connected to the fact that the two people are still having the conflict on the state of Israel, on Palestine. We are talking and talking and talking, but it seems that it's very, very difficult to really approach and reach a peace treaty. And don't forget that the Israeli Arabs are Palestinians. And we dear them and we care for them, and they absolutely deserve to have all the rights as the other citizens of Israel, the Jews and the others. But on reality, we are not there. Should we be there? Yes. Should we do more in order to be there? Yes. Is it only depend of having peace? No. We have to do that even if we don't have peace. Peace shouldn't be excuse for not giving the equal rights to all the citizens, that's for sure. But I have to admit that we have to do more.
So let's jump to Germany. And after now Ophir had added to the challenges that with the immigration, a whole bunch of Israelis, which for sure will mix up the picture. Still, I want to ask you, how do you see? What is the one dimension, the most important dimension that symbolizes the challenge of integration in Germany?
Oh my God. This one thing. I'm not sure if I can tell you everything in English because it's a very difficult issue. And I try... Da, so? Yeah? Ah, good. I will try my best to let you hear and to let you understand what I think about. Well, this is a very difficult situation, democratic situation here on the panel. We have three people who are living in Israel, and I'm the only German Jew from East Berlin, so talking about Germany, so this is a little difficult, but I'm...
Don't worry, I'm a minority too.
Yes, yeah.
3 Jews
I'm
and
the
1
minority
Muslim.
between all of you. Okay, I don't want to have this dilemma you have in Israel with this, with the question of identity, religion, and ethnicity. This is a very, very difficult situation you have to deal with. And I'm very happy that I don't have to deal with that, because in Germany we have enough problems, so it would be even more complicated to do so in Germany. So I admire very much all the efforts you are doing to deal with this situation, what is really complicated as I see. I'm sure if I would live in Israel, just to let you know, I would do also a project against racism and discrimination. But I'm here in Germany and I'm working here, and this is enough. work to do, because we have a lot of problems here with racism, with integration of immigrants, with neo-Nazis, and with anti-Semitism. And we are trying to do our best to make Germany a country where there's no ethnic discrimination. You still have a situation here in Germany where people who are not looking German are not considered to be German. This is different in Israel. In Israel, it's not an ethnic problem. It's more a problem of heritage, of confession, of the Jewish background or not Jewish background. In Germany, there is. If I have a lot of friends who are immigrants or who are black people, and they have a lot of problems, I can tell you, with the daily discrimination here in Germany. They are treated, of course, also as temporary guests and plus racism. So in the moment when Angela Merkel told I think it was in 2009, she said multiculturalism is dead. This was a very stupid moment, and I don't think she would repeat this in those days, because everybody knows that the future of Germany will be a future of different heritages and with a very mixed society, with a lot of immigrants or well, it is becoming more and more mixed, yes? And that's why the efforts of the state should grow in do a policy of equal rights and equality, of living equality and not just talking about that. And we are far away from this in Germany till today. As a very funny story, I lived through in 1990. It was in August, the beginning of August of 1990, my first trip to a capitalist state from East Germany, GDR, where I used to be the ombudswoman for immigrants in the city of East Berlin, the capital of the GDR. My first trip brought me to Israel, of course. I had to go to Israel. And the GDR didn't have any embassy there, so I was invited to the embassy of the German Federal Republic. So somebody took care of me, and he asked me what I wanted to do there. And I said, well, I want to learn something about integration, because Israel does such a good work and integrates so many different groups who are doing aliyah in Israel. And I want to learn, because we in East Germany now have 2 minority groups who are coming in still GDR time, the Gypsies and the Jews. And they asked me, what Jews? I said, from the Soviet Union. The Jews from the Soviet Union are coming to Berlin, and they want to stay here, and I just wanted to see how Israel is dealing with that. And this was very funny, because he tried to connect me to some people, and they looked at me. Sie haben mir sehr misstraut. How do you say? They were very suspicious, you know. There was a lady coming from East Germany, from communist Germany, living in East Jerusalem, in American colony, was guided by an Arab Israeli, and wanted to talk about immigration to Germany of Russian Jews. And her name was Kahane, so this was too much for a lot of them. So this was very. But I learned very much. Well, let me tell you in German, because this is too complicated for me. My English is so terrible. I have to apologize. Ich muss noch mal kurz auf. Also es ist in der Tat ein großes Problem, was ich nicht teilen möchte mit den Israelis, das mit der Identität und der Herkunft und der Religion und so weiter. Weil in Deutschland ist es ganz einfach. I'm just repeating what I said. In Deutschland ist es ganz einfach. Entweder werden hier die Menschen nach den Kriterien der Menschenrechte gleich behandelt oder nicht. Es gibt da bis auf diejenigen, die Deutschland unbedingt weiß und reinhalten wollen, also die Nazis und deren Verbündete, gibt es keine ernstzunehmenden Kräfte, die fürchten, dass das Abendland untergeht, wenn es hier mehr Einwanderer gibt. Ganz egal, ob sie sozusagen aus Afrika kommen, aus Asien oder aus Südeuropa oder der Türkei. Insofern ist es ganz wichtig und mein Selbstverständnis für das, was ich mache in der Amadeo-Antonio-Stiftung, bezieht sich da unmittelbar auch aus meiner jüdischen Identität zu sagen, ich habe mich sozusagen dem Gedanken von Tikkun Olam verschrieben und das ist etwas, was, wie ich mein Jüdischsein übersetze in diese Gesellschaft hinein, also dafür zu sorgen, dass Menschen nicht wegen ihrer Hautfarbe, sexuellen Orientierung und so weiter und so fort diskriminiert werden. Und meiner Meinung nach ist das eine zutiefst jüdische Angelegenheit, auch außerhalb der jüdischen Gemeinden dafür zu sorgen, dass auch die Juden sich dafür engagieren, dass hier keine Diskriminierung oder Rechtsextremismus stattfindet, ungestraft. Ich weiß, dass es da innerhalb auch der jüdischen Gemeinschaft auch unterschiedliche Meinungen gibt zu dem Problem. Universalismus ist etwas Jüdisches, das ist etwas sehr Jüdisches von seinem Gedanken her, aber man kann ihn sich nicht immer leisten. Das ist etwas, was Israel immer wieder erlebt. Wir hier in Deutschland können ihn uns leisten, weil hier der Staat Deutschland die Juden beschützt und weil es seine verdammte Aufgabe ist, das auch für alle anderen zu tun. Viele Juden in Deutschland haben allerdings Furcht manchmal, dass zu viel Einwanderung aus sogenannten muslimischen Ländern kommt und sie durch importierten Antisemitismus aus Krisengebieten dann selbst darunter zu leiden haben. An der Stelle kann ich nur sagen, das ist eine ernstzunehmende Befürchtung und dazu muss man auch handeln, dazu muss man auch etwas tun. Da ist auch der Staat gefordert auf der einen Seite, auf der anderen Seite sind die Freunde Israels und die Freunde der Juden, die immer sagen, sie wollen in Deutschland keine Muslime haben und sie finden den Islam ganz kreuzgefährlich und hassen ihn. Das sind in Wirklichkeit auch keine Freunde der Juden. Denn wie viele Beispiele mir gezeigt haben, ist es so, dass immer wieder Leute, die vorgeben, sozusagen Freunde der Juden und Israel zu sein und gegen den Islam und Muslime sind, am Ende dann sich doch als Antisemiten rausstellen. Und wenn Sie wollen, werde ich Ihnen ganz schnell noch eine Geschichte erzählen, die das illustriert, weil ich kann das nicht auf Englisch. Das ist eine Geschichte, die betrifft den Bürgermeister von Neukölln. Das ist ein Berliner Stadtbezirk. Dieser Bürgermeister, Herr Buschkowski, ist bekannt dafür, dass er sehr islamkritisch ist und immer wieder draufhaut und sehr starke Worte wählt gegen seine arabisch-türkische Community in seinem eigenen Stadtbezirk. Dieser Bürgermeister, denken manche Leute, die Israel-Freunde sind oder affin sozusagen, ist, wenn er sich gegen die Muslime artikuliert, möglicherweise die Juden beschützt. Das ist aber nicht der Fall. Wir hatten neulich, vor einem Jahr ist ein Rabbiner in Berlin zusammengeschlagen worden, der Rabbiner Alter. Und dieser Rabbiner hat irgendwann jetzt vor ein paar Wochen gesagt, es gibt in Berlin No-Go-Areas für Juden, sie werden besonders bedroht durch muslimische oder also arabische, türkische Jugendliche, die aggressiv auf sie reagieren, wenn sie sich als Juden zeigen. Es gibt also No-Go-Areas. Daraufhin sagte der Bürgermeister von Neukölln, nee, also sowas gibt es bei uns nicht. Meine Neuköllner machen sowas nicht, das kann gar nicht sein. Kommen Sie doch mal her, Herr Rabbiner, wir setzen uns jetzt beide mal die Kippa auf und laufen mal durch Neukölln. Und wenn dann nichts passiert, dann sage ich Ihnen, siehste. Und da ist er mit dem Rabbiner dahin gegangen und natürlich ist nichts passiert und er sagte, siehste. Und daraufhin hat der Rabbiner gesagt, es ist aber jetzt eine besondere Situation und das kann man so jetzt nicht verallgemeinern, diese Situation, abgesehen davon, dass die Intention, mir zu sagen, dass ich mir das vielleicht ausgedacht habe oder möglicherweise etwas behaupte oder übertreibe, mir auch nicht so angenehm ist. Und daraufhin sagte dann der Bürgermeister Buschkowski, nee, also mit Ihnen kann man ja gar nicht reden, Sie sind da ja viel zu empfindlich, und ließ ihn auf der Straße stehen. So, und das Binnenverhältnis der verschiedenen Minderheitengruppen in Deutschland zu verbessern, ist auch ein Teil meiner Aufgabe. Und ich glaube, an der Stelle kann ich eine Menge auch von Israel lernen. Jedenfalls hoffe ich das.
Well, thank you very much for that. And Annetta, perhaps I will be able to follow up and perhaps challenge a little bit and relate to some of what you've said. I think we have a shared vision here amongst all the speakers so far. Let's figure out a way to create an integrated society, a shared society, a multicultural society, and let's do more if we're not doing enough. But as you have alluded to, right, reality, especially nowadays, is a bit more tricky. Right? When I was preparing for this, I was trying to find some information from public polls. And I found, for example, there were 2 polls, Munster University and Allenbach Institute. Over 70% of Eastern Germans and Western Germans have negative attitude toward Muslims. When Germans were asked about the recent statements of former President Wolf about Islam is a part of Germany, almost 80% said no, we do not agree. In Israel, by the way, things are not much better. 68% of Israeli Jews feel removed from Israeli Arabs. 66% say, well, we sort of rather not get in if we don't have to. On the other hand, almost 70% of Israeli Arabs reject the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, and 40% believe that the Holocaust did not happen. So the two societies are, to some degree, I think I would say, very much apart. I want to ask each of you, what can we all do in both sides to make it better? And also, is this vision, the comment, and Annette, you told me before that you did not like the fact that Chancellor Merkel said that multiculturalism is dead, but this was a big statement because she referred, I think, to this question about the identity of society. So I'm not sure if it's dead or alive, but can it be strengthened? Can it be revived? Is this still the vision that we need to share? And let's try to do shorter answers so we can move on.
I will start because yes, I think that there's no other way. We have to deal with that because the world is not only our country or the ethnicities and different minority groups inside our countries, but outside as well. And you have in a globalized world, you have more and more immigration, more and more flexibility. So there is no way, you cannot live without an idea of a mixed society in every country of the world. And so our developed countries, so-called in Europe, have a problem because the globalization is bringing up a huge middle class in other countries, like in China or Brazil, in Africa or in Asia, and in the white countries, the development is not so positive. So now it's a moment of sharing, and this will also express itself in the form of immigration movements. So there is no other possibility. We have to deal with that. Or we don't have any future in our countries.
Okay, yeah. Ophir, what do you think? Multiculturalism or nothing?
Actually, I think that Annette is quite right. I think that, and for us Israelis, it's even more difficult. It's even more complicated because we have, as I said, we established the Jewish state for the Jewish people. Now, the concept of Jewish state for the Jewish people was very strong one and very right one after the Holocaust and because of many other reasons. But the world is changing. The world is changing. And we also have lots of immigrants, nothing to do with Muhammad or with Arab citizens. I'm talking about immigrants that comes from Africa, because we are the gate between Africa and Asia, and many take advantage of that. We have large immigration that comes from Egypt to Israel. If you come to Tel Aviv these days, to South Tel Aviv, you can witness tens of thousands of immigrants, maybe more, Shlomo, I think hundreds of thousands. And I spoke to Ron Huldaï, the mayor of Tel Aviv, and I have to tell you honestly that he's almost helpless. He's almost helpless. You know, he's the mayor of Tel Aviv, but he's not really the mayor of Tel Aviv. He's the mayor of half Tel Aviv, or two-thirds of Tel Aviv. And no one really gives concrete answers. He blames the government, maybe the government blames him, I don't know who, but if you are looking at that deeply enough, you can understand that we don't have an immigrant or integration policy as a state. Because, why we don't have it? Because it's very, very difficult to have such a policy. I tried to deal with that as well when I was in that position. It's very difficult because then you have to ask yourself the most deepest questions that connected to the very heart and nature of the state of Israel, and that's frightening, by the way, and it's very problematic, and no one really knows how to handle that. So you just live with it. But if you will look at the word, let's say 100 years from now, not 1,000 years, 100 years from now, it will be a completely different world, because people will come from China. They're already coming from China to America, from America to Europe, from Europe to Africa, from Africa to Asia. I mean, the mixed cultures and mixed. That's going to be the normal behavior, I think. And I think that the countries will need to be open they will have to open themselves. They cannot ignore that, they cannot put walls, but it should go together with peace. If it won't go together with peace, we are going to have chaos. It should go with peace, and if I might say, we have to understand we have to restrain in a way, forgive me for saying that, but we have to restrain in a way the role of religious. I think that there is a problem when religious become too strong and sometimes a little bit too extreme. I'm not talking about which religious, religious, you know, then it's a problem. It's a problem, and we have to take it into consideration and try to have it in a different way.
Mohammed, what can the two parties in Israel, on the one hand the Jewish population, the Arab population, and the government, can do to narrow that gap?
Well, before I answer that, Nir, let me say that absorption of minorities or absorption of immigrants should not be a matter of national war or peace situation. To treat my children equally in education budget has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are many issues of social welfare that have nothing to do with security issues. These are human value issues, human rights issues, basic democratic nature of the state that need to fulfill itself. So I do not have any doubt that Ophir has commitment to equality on the social economic issues, but I do understand that there are some fears that many people can relate to the security concerns, like political organization and certain political freedoms. But when you speak, at least on the social economic issues of integration, the lack of peace between Israel and the Palestinians cannot be used as an excuse. In 1992, during the Rabin government, I would say this was the first time that Israel went out of the denial stage of its responsibility for absorbing the Arab citizens and treating them as equals. And that was not just a result of the peace process. It was, I think you were a minister at the time, minister of, no? You were in your way to becoming a minister. But that was the first time that the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, decided that the Arab citizens are here to stay, they're legitimate citizens, and that the state of the Jewish people is not going to be pure ethnic homeland for the Jews only. And it started some first stages in equal treatment of the Arab citizens. Another professor, not Shlomo Avineri, once told me that if you're able to identify the problem, that's half of the solution. And over the next few years, the state was trying to identify what are the critical issues for the proper absorption of the Arab citizens as equals in Israel. Until that time, we were using the term coexistence between Jews and Arabs. And I think that the term that we use better today is, first of all, existence, equal existence that will lead for shared society. How do you build a shared society that is built of different fragments or different sections of it? So, you could use the multicultural term. I'm not sure if I want to get fixated on one term, but I know that building a shared society is not an easy business. Over the past, in fact, before I go next, on July 10th, 2007, the then Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, made an interesting statement in a Haifa conference. He said, the state of Israel has been institutionally and consciously discriminating against its Arab citizens. Again, getting out of the denial stage. This is not anti-Semitic propaganda. It's the Prime Minister of Israel saying it, admitting responsibility for the policies of discrimination against Arab citizens. He continued afterwards, he said, this has to end because this is in Israel's best national security. Recognizing that discrimination against Arab citizens negates Israel's national security. He wanted to explain that sustaining poverty in the Arab community is actually sustaining anti-state feelings. It's allowing anti-Jewish feelings to continue to grow. People that are in poverty, they look for who's responsible for their poverty, who's responsible for their bad situation. And when they see that it's the state of Israel that defines itself as the state of only for the 80%, it's an 80% state. Can you comprehend what I'm saying? A country says, I'm not 100% country, I'm only 80%. That's stupid political science. Whoever says that is stupid political scientist. The state, first of all, is a political club for its own citizens, and then it can serve another national, ethnic, political purpose. But it cannot exempt itself from the basic responsibility of being the state of its citizens. Now, since then, I was lucky to push and succeed in a number of areas. One of the areas that after the October 2000 clashes, which left 13 Arab citizens killed by Israeli police, was asking to review the policing services in the Arab community. There was a commission, government commission called the Or Commission, which was headed by Supreme Court Justice Theodore Orr. And in one of the sentences of in the report, Supreme Court Justice says, Orr says, the Israeli police has viewed the Arab citizens as enemies to be controlled, going back to the conflict, as enemies to be controlled instead of citizens to be serviced. Now put this enemies to be controlled, citizens to be serviced, put it in a spectrum, and imagine an encounter between an Israeli police officer and an Arab citizen. And since then, we went and asked the police to reform its relationship to the Arab citizens, and I can happily, if we're here to speak about successes, I can happily tell you that the Israeli police did make significant reforms since. The number of Arab officers in the force increased from 1% to 8% in 13 years. The number of police stations in Arab towns and villages increased from 3 stations to 49 stations today, and on in other areas.
And if I'm not mistaken, you are training occasionally and speaking to police officers about these issues.
We do a lot of work in not just having the Israeli police enter Arab towns and villages, but have them develop the capacity to do culturally sensitive police. For example, I'll give you one simple example. In Muslim culture, if you take a dog in a house search and you take the dog to the prayer room in the house, that's an insult. And it's desecrating the prayer place. It's like taking a pig inside a synagogue. So, and if you want to do proper policing, you need to understand that as a police officer. You cannot just go knock on the door and do the normal police service that you in the Jewish community, just bring it and apply it in a Muslim Arab community. So cultural sensitivity in policing allows you to do better policing. Another area which we've been very active in my work, the whole issue of equipping the Arab citizens with the right tools to enter the academic and the work fields. We know, and I'll give you a very simple example. I'd like to, instead of speaking theories, I'll give you a live example. We've worked closely with the Technion, which is Israel's top science institution in Israel, on the percentage of Arab students that are studying at the Technion. 7 years ago, the Technion, which is in the north, and the north has almost 50% Arab citizens, the Technion had only 3% Arab students. And the reason was that those Arab students were not qualifying to be accepted. They were failing with their Hebrew tests, they were failing with their psychometric tests in getting accepted. A project that was supported by 2 Israeli Jewish business leaders offered Arab students after high school, offered them 1 year preparatory year to improve their skills so that they can enter first year at the Technion. Today the percentage, 7 years later, the percentage of Arab students at the Technion is 22%. Those are kids that are studying biomedical science, computer engineering, contributing very soon to the leading areas of Israeli economy. So when there is affirmative action work, you can get some results. The Prime Minister's Office and the Finance Ministry applied in 2009 a project to support Arab businesses, emerging Arab businesses. And I'll give you also my last example. A group of 6 Arab computer engineers, graduates of the Technion, spent 4 years looking for a job, and they were not employed because they were Arab citizens. Again, excuse of security, that high-tech companies cannot employ Arab citizens because of security. Another couple of people, I'm sorry I can't understand you. If I could understand you, I could answer. So a couple of Israeli Jewish business leaders decided to provide support with assistance from the Prime Minister's Office, Unit of Economic Development, Authority on Economic Development. They employed those 6 Arab engineers who tried to compete for jobs that were going to China and India because it was cheaper. And they created the company in Nazareth, in north of Israel, providing the Israeli Tel Aviv companies with China and India prices. As I said, it was 6 years ago. Today the company has 160 engineers. They charge Tel Aviv prices because now they sell quality. They don't sell the price of India. They've grown dramatically from 6 to 160, and last year they even employed 30 Jewish engineers because they want skills and they want a full portfolio of services that are not available in the Arab community. Which basically leads me to say that when there is a will, of government, when there's a will of individuals, people with the right commitment for the proper shared society, you can find answers and you can find solutions. I think that over the past, since in fact 1992, over the past almost 20 years, we've made significant progress, first and foremost, in changing the mindset of Israeli society that the Arab citizens are legitimate citizens, and the progress has mainly gone in the social economic arenas. Unfortunately, in the political legitimacy of Arab citizens, we're still dragging behind. No one can imagine today one of the Arab political parties to be part of any coalition in Israel. Again, maybe because of the conflict.
Can I ask you a question, but Muhammad?
Let me just finish this and then you can ask. But maybe because it's a result of the conflict that sort of makes it difficult for people to speak about political integration, easier to talk about social economic integration. And I'm not here to be critical of Israel. I'm here to basically celebrate with you the successes that we're making in this area. But to succeed, it means that you have to change the reality of discrimination. And we are making successes despite the fact there are a lot of forces inside Israel that are trying to drag us behind, and forces in the Arab community that think that integration in Israeli society is something wrong to do. You can ask me.
As you know, the military service in Israel for Jews is a must, and for Arabs, it's only if they choose to volunteer, and some of them does, the minority does, most of them are not, they don't want to serve in the army. But what do you think about the civil service that now is growing? You know that more and more Arab Israelis choose to serve at the civil service, kind of a civil service for society, and contribute to the society, 1 year or something like that. How do you feel about the fact that it's growing, that more and more Arabs, youngsters, are participating in such activities?
Today there are about 2,600 Arab youth ages of 18 to 22 that are serving in civil service, which is an alternative service to military service.
It's a small number, relatively small number.
Let him answer.
The number of Arab citizens in that age bracket is approximately 60,000. So when you talk about 2,600 out of 60,000, it's a very small number. Now, I'll split my answer in two. One is I do think that every citizen should give something to society, and I would like every Arab citizen to give a service to society, to the Arab society, to the Jewish society, to the Israeli society. And I think that the notion of community service is essential if we want to build a cohesive, shared society. There's no question about this. I do have some issues with the current government program, and the majority of the Arab community have issues with the current government program, and that's why the response is so little. And that's why my work has been focused over the past 3 years, not just on criticizing the government shortfall, but trying to create alternative programs of real civil service and not semi-military service. The current program is managed through the Prime Minister's office and budgeted through the Defense Ministry and through the military. As long as it is funded and the money comes through the military, you will have less and less Arabs willing to participate in there. I made recommendations in writing and in formal presentation at the Knesset. I think Yochanan Plesner is here, just joined us. We even spoke at his commission in the Knesset on this matter to create an alternative, completely civilian route that will be managed through other social welfare agencies in the country or the Arab municipalities to provide an umbrella of legitimacy from the Arab community for the issue of service. If it is about civil service, let's make it civil. Let's take it out of the military establishment, out of the security establishment, and bring it in civilian roots. And I do want every one of my 4 children to be in this kind of program. I do want every Arab citizen to be into this kind of program, because I think it's not only service to the Jewish community or to the state of Israel. It's service to our own community. It is service for proper integration, and it is, yes, paying tax for society. You have to give something to society if you are in the business of asking also for your rights. There are also duties you have to give to society.
Aneta, let me put perhaps the last question for you, and then in the interest of time, then I'll ask for any other concluding remarks. Following up to what we've just heard, which was a lot about government and government programs. Now, naturally, the government can always do more and better. But can you comment on what the German government is doing on policies of integration? Are some of these stories that you've just heard are parallel? Is what Has some of these programs developed? Are there any things that perhaps Israel can learn from, or vice versa?
Yeah. Well, there are some things. Some of the issues are very different, but some also sound very familiar to me. Like, for instance, the school programs for the integration of immigrant kids and the higher level to reach higher level of school. And there has to be done a lot of reforms also in the schools to on the politics to see that these are all our kids, you know, our kids. It's not those kids or that kids, but it's all our kids. It's the human source of the future. So they have to understand this is only going together. So we cannot just forget 1/3 of the population because they are from immigrant background. Well, the government is trying, but it's always a very, very slow process. We had a first step in 1998 with this option to have a German citizenship for kids who are born in Germany, even with the immigrant parents. But then after 18 years, they have to choose their citizenship. So in this time, they are still in a position to wait if they will be accepted or if they will not be accepted. They are not really us, you know, and this is also a very difficult situation for an entire generation of immigrant kids who have to choose their identity. They have to think always about identity as long as they don't have the real German citizenship. And this is one point, and the other is that the government must do much more against racism and neo-Nazis. We have a big problem with neo-Nazis, especially in East Germany, where the neo-Nazis were so successful that we have less than 1% of visible minorities in East Germany. I mean, imagine, this is a complete white area. And it's because of the fear of the people who don't want to go to the East because they know that they have a high risk of being beaten up in East Germany by neo-Nazis. We have this problem now with the refugees who come from Syria or other states, and they have to go to the East, so we have some demonstrations from neo-Nazis. They are so awful, you cannot imagine they're going there with this fire, Flaggen, you know, and this reminds very much of the Nazi time. And there the government must be very much more active and treat the civil society, the grassroots initiatives, all the people who are doing something about that, because you cannot solve everything with political resolutions. You have to give money, you have to give help, you have to give support to the people in the little towns and cities in all these areas. And this is very difficult. They don't really give much money. You know, they give the German government gives about 20 million or 30 million euro for all the entire work in this field. This is like, you know, building a bridge to cross the highway. And well, this work is much more important. It needs much more funding and much more support than we get in this moment. So I think the key point is still to accept that this is a multicultural society that there is no way back to a white, pure German country, that we have to live together in peace with all the groups and ethnic groups and all the mixed kids who are growing up now. And if the state will recognize this and give enough money for creating the conditions to fight against racism and neo-Nazis, then it has a chance.
So now we are talking, that's the general remarks, the conclusion.
Bottom line.
Bottom line. The bottom line is that I miss Yitzhak Rabin. I miss Yitzhak Rabin. I miss Prime Minister. That's the bottom line. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered 18 years ago by a Jewish terrorist because Yitzhak Rabin wanted to change Israel for the better. He wanted to have normal priorities. He wanted to bridge the gaps between Jews and Arabs. He wanted to invest in education in order to build the future for our youngsters. He wanted to end the occupation and the settlements and have peace with the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Authority. That's why he was murdered. And unfortunately, we until now at least, we are way back. We are still way back, and I don't see in the near future any Israeli leader that is willing to change it and is able to change it. But, there's always but we have to believe that one day, sometime, we'll have the right leadership that will change it. It must be changed. Israel cannot continue to live it at the same parameters, in the same way. It won't last forever. It won't last forever. And if we want Israel to stay forever and ever, we have to change that as soon as possible. And the second thing that I would like to say, that I have a dream. And in my dream, there is an Israeli government and there is an Israeli prime minister that was elected that has a majority in the Knesset, that will participate maybe some of the Arab parties in the Knesset inside his coalition. I think that we have to collaborate also in the political arena. I think that there is time, and I hope that if one day there will be prime minister from the left or from the central left, for instance, from Labour Party or something like that, he will have the guts to confront the public opinion and try to establish a coalition that includes at least one Arab party as a legitimate full member of the coalition. I think it's doable. It's very hard. It's very difficult, but it's doable, and I hope that I will be able to live and see that dream come true.
Ophir, does this mean you're coming back to politics? Does this mean you're coming back to politics? That was a no comment. Muhammad, who do you miss?
Well, first of all, I miss Ophir back in politics. And, I was first, and another comment, Anita, you should make Aliyah. If you hold those views, we can use people like you in Israel. And I think that if we want to be able to move forward, we need to try to make sure that legislation in democratic societies supports shared society. And unfortunately, very often we see in Israel some attempts to pull us in the wrong direction. Luckily, the legislation committee in the government has been able to block most of the attempts that are discriminatory in nature and that are anti-democratic in nature. And I hope that they'll succeed not only in blocking that, but also in trying to create alternatives. And this is definitely a word of tribute to Tzipi Livni, who chairs that committee in the government. We have to find the ways to uproot discrimination and racism, and that cannot just happen by counting on children encounters and putting the responsibility on the shoulders of Jewish and Arab kids that meet and draw together or eat hummus together. That has to come also with the leadership that takes that kind of responsibility. And my last contribution to this panel is that the shared society needs content. And the content needs to be in the form of common denominators. what can be common for Jewish and Arab citizens in Israel, whether it is the content of the education that they study, where they study and share the same values, the same principles of social behavior, democratic behavior, commitment to principles, democratic principles, and so on. I want to see Israel be more Israeli. And the term Israeli needs to be full, where people can say, people that stood on this panel and on that podium, they can come and say, we want to strengthen Israel, the Israeli society, and not just the Jewish society in Israel. The use of the Jewish nature of Israel only is discriminatory by its essence. If you want to contribute to Israel, contribute to 100% Israel. Be 100% Israeli and not 80% Israeli. 80% Israeli is limited Israeli identity, and I think is doing disservice to Israel. I think every Israeli leader and every supporter of Israel need to recognize that 100% picture of the state of Israel, and not only out of goodness for the minority. I think this is of strategic value for the state of Israel. Some people, when I went to elementary school and then to high school, in my pedagogic studies, they were using the term that the Israeli Arab citizens are ultimately the bridge for peace between Israel and the Arab world. I do want to be the bridge for peace between Israel and the Arab world, but I don't want to be a bridge that people only walk on. I want to be a bridge that has strong foundation inside Israel, to be able to act as a proud Israeli and be able to say that Israelis and Jews, the Jewish Israelis that came to live in the Middle East, came to live in peace with us, and I will be the example for that kind of peace as an equal Israeli citizen. Thank you.
Well, like a bridge over troubled waters, I will find my way. There is a sentence in Hebrew, Tam velo nishlam, it's ended but not concluded. Unfortunately, on the spirit of moving forward, the Congress needs to continue. And at that point, I think I will have to say thank you very much for our three distinguished speakers. I think they deserve a round of applause. It is not over because obviously there are many questions that remained unanswered, but I personally would like to thank you first of all for the spirit, for the honesty, and I also think for the hope, because I think we've heard, despite of some of these complex situations and the data that is not very pleasant at times, we also hear not only of good efforts, but also of some stories of success, and that is always a good point to end with. So thank you very, very much.
Das Thema des Panels fokussiert sich auf die Zukunft der deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen. Wie sehen diese Beziehungen im Jahr 2025 aus? Das ist gar nicht so lange hin. Ich denke aber, wenn man sich mit der Zukunft beschäftigen möchte, dann sollte man sich auch erlauben, erst einmal einen Blick auf die aktuellen deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen zu werfen und dabei auch den Schwerpunkt ein wenig auf Sicherheitsthemen, außenpolitische Themen zu legen. Das ergibt sich einfach auch durch die Zusammensetzung dieses Panels. Ich weiß, dass es häufig so wahrgenommen wird, ich glaube, das hat man hier in den Diskussionen auch schon so erlebt, dass auf der einen Seite die deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen als sehr, sehr, sehr gut bezeichnet werden, sehr eng, freundschaftlich und natürlich ganz besonders aufgrund der historischen Verantwortung Deutschlands für die Shoah. Andererseits haben wir immer wieder auch die Momente, in denen eben gerade von Deutschland aus sehr stark auf Israel mit der Brille des Konflikts geblickt wird und starke Kritik an Israel geübt wird. Und ich weiß, dass einigen meiner Panelisten es wichtig wäre, danach zu suchen, wie man eigentlich eine konstruktivere Rolle Deutschlands auch in dieser Hinsicht gestalten könnte, wie man diesen Widerspruch langfristig auch auflösen könnte. Und deshalb meine erste Frage an David Zur, was wären Ihre Empfehlungen, um tatsächlich einen konstruktiveren Ansatz oder eine konstruktivere Rolle Deutschlands in dieser Thematik zu finden?
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. And I want to, I will maybe give some remarks on the panel which we had before. And I want to say to Muhammad, maybe I'm the very few officers which testified in the OR investigation as the chief of staff of Minister Ben-Ami. And my career didn't stop and went even up and up. And I was very, very satisfied to hear from you the fact that the main issue, which was mentioned in the OR committee, lack of presence of the police, the community policing, especially in the Arab communities, this is something which can reduce dramatically the attitude and also the violence before it happened. And I want to say to Ophir that I'm sharing with him the same dream. And I miss Rabin too, because we lack of leadership which can take a very hard decision in order to move forward. I think the fact that we don't have an Arab party in the coalition is part of some of the fears, political fears, yeah. And also I can say that to Muhammad that blaming all the time the government or somebody being on poverty, in a place that you are not equal. Sometimes that's 80% is the government, but the other 20% I can also say that you have to take responsibility in the communities in order to move forward. And I think your activity in the Abraham Fund is a very, very important. And there are a few projects which I'm today as a parliament member even involved in sport, and I will mention it. And maybe I'll start with that, about not because Germany is so good in sport. Unfortunately, as I said, we want to be equal with you very, very soon, but maybe 2025, as you said, maybe we can achieve this kind of level. From the security point of view, and also the Palestinian issue that we're dealing with for a century. And now I think we came to a very, very crucial timing. This negotiation going on, most of the people, if you ask them, they are pessimistic. And I can't say that I'm very optimistic, but I'm looking at that very in reality. And I think it's very important not to stuck at the narrative and to start arguing who's right and who was the first to be here, or who's got the full right for this land. We have to look at the situation in a way that we have to keep. First of all, Israel is a Jewish and democracy state, and to take care that also the security of the Israeli state, the Jewish state, will remain in a way that we can survive and build the society as we want, and also that the Palestinians will get their state, and the two-state solution is the only solution that we can achieve in order to have the prosperity and to move forward. Now it's very difficult. Those negotiations going on now, there is a discussion on all the issues, on the settlements, borders, the right to return, Jerusalem issues, in each one of those issues, there is a lot of titles and subjects, which probably we can achieve to kind of an agreement. The main issue, I think, the main obstacle is politically. Majority of the people of Israel are supporting the two-state solution. The majority of the Knesset is supporting the two-state solution. If there's going to be a referendum, which by the way, I'm opposed to a referendum because I don't think this is something to go back to the people to ask. I think we have been elected to take a decisions. We can be kind of a hostage of a radical who will blow a car in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv 1 or 2 days before the referendum, and we will get something we don't want. We are not Switzerland, that if you allow to smoke outside or inside, you go to a referendum. Israel doesn't have even history. We never did a referendum, so hopefully not for that issue, but this is a legislation which is now going on. I think, you asked me about the German, and just to close my first round about the German role in this issue. We see German as a very, very important country, especially on the influence on the EU, but not only. I think Germany is being seen also, of course, by Israel as a very close friend, but also I think it's been seen by the Palestinians, by the Arab countries, as a honest broker. The Americans are not being looked like that, sometimes even not for the right reason, but it's a fact that they have been not, we can't, the Palestinian doesn't look at them the same. I think the main role, and I want to give an answer to, I can't remember the name, but it was the name of the parliament member here at the first, I think, panel, who said that for Germany to take an active action to send people or to send soldiers to a conflict area, this is something which is against the DNA of the German people. We are not getting any involved in that. But what I think is that it's a very, very important that Germany can put their benefits economically, and especially on projects which can be promoted at the Palestinian area, mainly in the Palestinian, on mutual projects, Israeli and Palestinian projects, economically, infrastructure, and trying to put this kind of an effort. This is something which I think all of us can be very beneficial on that, and the incentive of moving into the process, into the peace agreement, will be much more when the economy is stable.
Thank you very much. I think that is a fantastic idea to take an also economic approach to develop the Palestinian areas, to work together with Israel. However, the EU this summer decided to agree on guidelines regarding the investments and cooperation in specific areas in Israel and in the region. Philip, I know that you are quite critical on that. What is your take on that, on the EU guidelines?
Thank you very much, Christina. It's not as easy for me to comment on subjects coming from Brussels when it's up to foreign policy issues, because I'm very skeptical to most of them, what they produce. The question is not only about Middle East issues, but in fact, as you said, it is right that we need a close, if we want to do something long-term and if very effective, it's not Europe's first issue to stabilize the security situation, because Israel itself is strong enough to stabilize their strategy itself when it comes to to arms deals, Germany will find always in Germany a very loyal partner, and that's not only about the chancellorship of Angela Merkel, but she's doing a great and fantastic job on this topic of the security partnership between both of our countries. But I think also other chancellors would support these arms deals, and they did it in the past. But more important is the economic exchange and also the youth exchange and all the other projects. I read a fantastic book about Israel as a high-tech nation. It is so interesting if you are an industrialized country like Germany is. It's so interesting to see where all the new developments, biotech, are coming from. It's California, and it's internet, and it's biotech as one example from Israel. So we should strengthen this economic exchange. And what's happening in Brussels right now, it's confusing, because they pick out one issue and this issue is overlapping more important debates. And I think this approach is wrong. And I believe sometimes, I don't know who is really behind it, but I think it is also one reason for that is also that there are many people working in Brussels who are too far away from a realpolitik approach, where they should notice what is the strategic interest and what is not. Because maybe I talked to some people from the administrations, why for hell they picked single issues like this and tried to blame Israel publicly, and then they showed me papers and exchanges of emails where you also can say that Israeli officials must have said something different than an Israeli official today might say. But this should not be so important that it becomes a front-page article. It should be, we should create much more effective programs when it comes to exchange on the education level or other things. There are great events in Israel, like Stef Wertheimer's initiative, for example, where he takes Germany's education, dual education programs as a template for his companies. So this is something we should talk about, and not necessarily about blaming and shaming.
Thank you, George. Johanan, I know that you are very much following the events in Iran, the talks in Geneva. We just heard that Germany might be a broker, a trusted broker. Are you happy with the role Germany took so far in the negotiations there?
Okay, first of all, thank you, and maybe I'll take the opportunity to thank the Adenauer Foundation and JNF and Sasha and Melody and the organizers. I've been in the first conference 2 or 3 years ago in Frankfurt, and there's no doubt that there's a major path was taken, and going forward to 2025, I'm sure we're going to have stronger and stronger conferences, and hopefully this venue will not be enough, but rather a much larger place. So there's a lot of room to expand this important initiative, and I commend you for that. With respect to you, basically you're asking, there are 2 points hidden in your question. One is the role of German leadership in global affairs, and the other is where exactly are we standing vis-a-vis the Iranian issue. I think with respect to the question of the role of German leadership, there's no doubt that, and I think I also mentioned it a couple of years ago, maybe those who remember at least, but I think Germany can no longer shy away from exercising global leadership. I think that I very much respect the fact that for many years, initially West Germany and later on the United Germany was under the umbrella of US policy, and and because of the problematic past, decided to shy away from taking an active role in shaping global affairs. And that's very respectable, and if I had to choose this path over an assertive, calm, aggressive Germany immediately after World War II, of course I would prefer the path that was taken. However, now we can no longer, i.e. the non-German members of the liberal democracies and of the free world, we can no longer afford a passive Germany. Germany is a strong country, probably the fourth world economy, I think #2 in terms of exports in the world, huge industry, probably the central and most important state player in Europe. We need this German powerhouse playing a more active role in global politics, especially when we're seeing that the United States is in some respect pulling back from the Middle East, pulling back from exercising leadership, that the United States is also expecting others to share the burden. And if we're talking about a Germany that is playing a more active role, and I know that it's a complex process of reshifting the German posture, but if we are to embark on such a new era, and therefore 2025 is a good time frame of looking how one should design a new era of German involvement. I think that Germany needs to have a clear global agenda for how it designs its involvement and how it protects freedom and democracies and the rule of law throughout the world, alongside with protecting other goals such as security and stability and prosperity and German allies and so on. So Germany needs to really develop a more sophisticated and a larger foreign policy apparatus that is really exercising leadership with respect to the and you know there's a void. If Germany doesn't enter into this void, other forces that might have a negative impact will enter, and therefore it's something that needs to happen. And maybe towards the 2025 generation, when we have new people and the shadows of the past maybe will cast a smaller shadow. It's a good time to design such an involvement. With respect to the issue of the Iranian issue right now, look, the worst outcome that can happen of a deal that will be reached with the Iranians is if we reduce the pressure. It took years to coordinate this pressure that was orchestrated throughout the international community, European Union, Americans, others at the UN, and this pressure apparently succeeded, and it succeeded more than what we anticipated. We have to say the truth. We didn't realize that the sanctions will be as effective, and they are effective. And the Iranians entered the current negotiation from a position of weakness, and now we have to make the most of this situation and of this context, and to ensure not that we are removing sanctions that later on it will be a lot more difficult to re-erect, but rather to remove the sanctions only after we realize that we're we're heading towards an end game that will remove the fear in the next few years of an Iranian threat. If we are to concede if a deal will basically allow Iran to remain threshold nuclear state that upon a decision can break into a bomb within weeks or months, that is not a deal that is worth taking. And definitely, if we talked about German leadership and designing a new German posture, in this issue, we don't have years and we don't have 10 years, we have hours or weeks for Germany to play an important role, because adopting a wrong policy in this issue, there's no second tries.
Maybe I want to just keep another point from the point Yochanan stopped it. I think historically we can see that in what's happening with the Arab Spring and also with the Iranian now closing a negotiation, that very strangely Israel, which been most threatened by Iran strategically, an existing threat, sharing a mutual interest with another country which is almost an existing threat for them, Saudi Arabia. And the fact that we see that the most, let's say, powerful Sunni Wahhabi state sharing the same maybe concern with Israel can definitely, in my opinion, strategically very much push the Palestinian issue. So it's a really, I think, the timing, not that the issues, the controversy or the conflict, the main points between us and the Palestinians will vanish. But I think that there are a much more strong, powerful pushing to get to the final agreement is coming from outside. And this is the timing which I think also the Palestinians very much understand. The incentive is very high. And I think politically also Israel, if it's very important for us that this threat of Iran will remain controlled. It's very important to move with the Palestinian issue. I can say that it's not by chance that there was a declaration of the Saudis and Qatar and their visit in the state about how important it is for the Arab countries and states, 52 states, to move to sign an agreement with Israel immediately after we sign with the Palestinians. So I think the timing, in a way, it's working for us. Me personally, I think that the fact that Europe and Germany's got a very, very important role, I think, in that. I accept with what Yochanan is saying about not letting the Iranian go back with an agreement which they don't, they still keep the capabilities, but the pressure is reduced. But on the other hand, I think we have to give this negotiation windows of opportunity very realistic, to give a chance, but being very realistic and not going after the smiles attack.
So, Philip, we see everything in the region seems to go hand in hand. The conflicts are depending somehow on each other. And we heard that exerting pressure on Iran seems to be the right way of trying to come to a solution here. Question would be, how much pressure is Germany willing to put on? How much pressure is Germany capable of putting on? And maybe also in general, what about a more proactive role of Germany, as Yohanan just asked for in the international security area?
So maybe, first of all, I think it was very good that Germany's mind, or the mind of many German officials, has changed when it comes to economic sanctions towards Iran, because it was over years, it was extremely hard, not only with the Scandinavian countries in the European Union, but also in Germany and also with huge German companies to discuss this question, because over years they were still convinced that the long-term relations they had to Iran are still part of economic relations, which more or less comes from the time before 1979, should be still a vehicle to convince Iran to do better, to find a new approach. But the problem was that they only listen to these very well-trained diplomats from Iran, and the only reason that they were talking so nicely sometimes was that they wanted to win time. I remember meetings with Iranian officials at the Munich Security Conference, for example, where I was always surprised how many dear colleagues of mine from the German Bundestag were really impressed about their presentations. And the problem was that, therefore, and I think if we look back in these negotiations, it was one of the most crucial points that we have implemented these, that we missed the chance to implement these crippling sanctions so late. Because now, as Johanna said, now you can see Rouhani and the whole core of the Iranian leadership is talking or is looking for other opportunities because they realize that these crippling sanctions are really hard to take for them. And I want to make it crystal clear, because I don't believe that there is a difference inside of Iran. I talked to people from the opposition in Iran who demonstrated against Ahmadinejad years ago. Even they are in favor of the nuclear program. So it is, and Rouhani is right when he said yesterday night that it is that they believe that it is a vital right for them and for their nation. So if we are talking about to have access to nuclear power, if we are talking about Staatsräson in Germany, then we are talking about a Staatsräson from Iran that they want to use nuclear power. And this is something really dangerous, because I think some of the Europeans have been blind over years, and therefore we shouldn't do this mistake again. And I agree 100% with my friend Johanna that we should not try to easing the situation for them. If there is something on the table which is signed by both sides, not only by a group of foreign secretaries, but also by the Israeli Prime Minister, and if this is signed by the Iranians and by the Israeli Prime Minister, then we can talk about easing the situation, but not giving up something before we have something in our hands. And one final sentence. I see the American administration very skeptical, not only because the way they are treating their allies, but it is even we will survive this NSA debate, and the NATO will survive this NSA debate, even if it's really negative for everybody. But at the end, if you listen to this administration in Washington, I'm sometimes surprised how much energy they spend to have any kind of progress or anything which is named progress. So it is not, they are not interested in a strategic advantage. They spend more time of having a diplomatic Pyrrhus victory, which is not necessarily a long-term victory for our coalition. And therefore, I believe we should be very, very careful with any kind of compromise in these negotiations. And I'm really glad that they haven't published yesterday night a compromise which is at the end the step for the Iranian leadership to achieve their goal.
We saw major disagreements between the Benjamin Netanyahu government and the Obama administration over the Iran negotiations. We already mentioned the EU guidelines, so there seem to be a lot of tensions in the relationships between the US and Israel and the EU and Israel right now. At the same time, you see that in countries in Asia, like in India and in China, there's big interest in dealing with Israel, having investments getting the grip on IT technology and knowledge. Johanna, is there a tendency or a danger that Israel might be disappointed by the West and might turn towards Asia?
Look, the relationship, Israel made a clear and conscious decision to develop our mainly economic relationship both with China and India. Alongside, we're also making attempts with Brazil and other countries, alongside our traditional trading partners, Europe and North America. But there's no doubt China and India are a major new market. We're investing, we're developing binational foundations for investment, various governmental programs that provide business development funds for Israeli companies to do business in China and vice versa and so on. So at the economic level, there's no doubt that the future of the world economy and the future growth and the new emerging powerhouses are in the East, and that we have to be a part of it. And obviously there are good markets and a good synergy for Israeli innovation to work alongside with industrial and manufacturing capabilities both in India and especially in China. And therefore this is definitely a target of Israeli policy. At the same time, politically, and diplomatically, there's no doubt that Israel's two key allies are first and foremost the United States, and this did not change and will not change in the foreseeable future. And we take into account the needs of our American ally very closely. And if it means that we limit the development of the relationship with China as a result of that, then we do that. And that means that in some technological areas we minimize the exchange of knowledge with the Chinese and so on. There's no substitute for a deep relationship with the United States that is based on shared interests and shared values, and a deep web of relations between not only the governments but the people. And this is not going to change regardless of arguments between the administrations or between leaders or lack of chemistry and so on. This has always been the case, and there were ups and downs, but the fundamentals are there. And the same thing is with, I said there are two close and intimate allies. The first is the US and the second is Germany. And for Israel, you know, I think the sense is that when push comes to shove, we can rely on our American ally and we can rely on our German ally. And I think our goal in expanding the relationship with Germany is that it will not only be based on an alliance and close, intimate relationship between the political and bureaucratic elites of the two countries, but it has to be a closer affinity between the people. And this is something that I think exists more in our relationship with the Americans, and unfortunately needs to be further nurtured and developed when, as far as our relationship with Germany is concerned.
Thank you. I think that would be also a task for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, because it's one of the main aims we have with our office in Jerusalem to foster especially these kind of relationships, not only on a top level, but most prominently really on the people-to-people contact level. And I think it comes back to what Philip said right at the beginning, that youth exchange and also economic exchange is important. I would like to focus on this topic of economic exchange and also research cooperation. We are now in a phase where we are waiting for the final answer to the question, will the Horizon 2020 agreement be signed by Israel and the EU, yes or no? David, what is your take on that?
In my opinion, it will be. It will be signed with all the obstacles which are being today. In my dream, my future views is that hopefully till 2025, even much earlier, we will end the conflict with the Palestinians. Finally, we can draw the borders with all the swap of lands, one by one, or other ideas which are on the table. So it can, and it can create a border which is, because we have to say that the Israeli-Arab conflict with Egypt, let's say, or Syria, or even with other countries. With Egypt, it was easy to sign an agreement and to cut the deal. We need the leadership from both sides. And I think economically, the role of Germany on coming the 2025, 10 years from now, that investments, not only bilateral, not only by government, I'm talking about private equity, which can be invested in this area, is a very important for both countries. And I think the potential is great. Israeli numbers today, the economy of Israel is growing with all the numbers which you can look at the EU. The GPC, we are about 4.5, and the unemployment is about 6%. And this is something, comparing to Europe even, the numbers are very good. You said that you read the book, it's the Israeli startup, and we are a nation of startup, but we don't have any plans to do an exit about the country. If Muhammad, you have any ideas? So we are not doing an exit from this startup, but it's a nation which can, we in the Palestinians can create, as I said, if we're looking, and somebody this morning talked about democracy, trying to bring democracy to those countries, to some of the Arab countries, or some of the, we believe that Palestinians have the most democracy ideas. Democracy from the Arab countries, if I can say it, saying it clearly, we find that the society of the Palestinian is much more close to democracy than others that we can imagine. Also, so that's why I think we can share quite a lot of the things with the Palestinians, and economically, and also and Germany, I think, can play a very, very important role. I think also the youth, because peace is made by people to people, not by governments. And this is one of the things I think we are lack of it in both societies. And unfortunately, the youth generation is going more radical than liberal on, I think, both countries, both societies. And this is something that I think we have to work on it. And projects like Adenauer, Abraham found, another Rashi, and other which can create also education, also small business, and create mutual projects between us and Palestinians. This is going to be, and German. This is something which I would love to see to the future.
At this point, I would like to turn the view around and ask Philip, I mean, when you look at Israel and Germany, there are a lot of parallels between both countries economically. Like, both do not have any major resources. We are countries that have knowledge-intensive industries. We are dependent on, well, education. What can Germany learn from Israel, especially regarding the IT expertise and startup culture Israel has?
So, because the title of the book, which I recently read, was Startup Nation, and it was recommended to me by one of the founders of DLD. DLD is an initiative of Hubert Burda's company, and they are doing a great job when it comes to not only venture capital, but it's also the question of how we can design this new digital life and digital time we are living in, and that is incredible. It's incredible to see what what Israel is and young Israeli entrepreneurs are doing in this country. And even also, if you have a look on the military sector, it is fantastic. The success of the research and the success of how you can implement new technologies into products. And I think one of the reasons that, and I think it's also a philosophical question for the Western world, of course all of us feel that we are not any longer in such a good position as we have been over the period of the Cold War, because in former times everybody believed that democracy itself is the reason that we, in a moral sense, we are in a moral sense better than others and dictators. If you have a look on these, as Johanna said, and also you said about the economical changes around the world, it's not necessarily that you have the combination of democratic development and long-term economic success for your country. This has changed. But if you have a close look on these high-tech developments, there are only 2 countries in the world which are extremely successful. And this is Israel and this is America. Because of, I believe, because of the fact that these are open societies and extremely liberal societies. And if you want to invent a climate of creativity, this is a fundament for it. You can have a look on Skolkovo in Moscow, for example. They invested a huge amount of money. They invited many people. Yeah, there's many people from Germany, many people from Israel to invest there, and it was a good idea. But the problem is nothing is happening there, and it's not only about corruption; it's also about the question in which is the climate in where creativity can grow, and this is something extremely interesting also for Germany, and we are far behind Israel on this sector. In this town, in Berlin, it's getting better and better. But what is still missing is that we are able to invent also how we can translate new technologies into products. This is something which the gap between Germany and Israel is very huge, and therefore I think we can learn a lot from this sector, economic sector in Israel.
There is another field of policy where Germany might learn a lot from Israel, I guess. Johanna, I think you have 3 daughters or 4 daughters? 3, 4?
3.5.
3.5, okay. Okay. So I was really astonished reading or hearing about the high birth rate in Israel. And the other day we just had a study coming out, being published, about the disaster of the very low birth rate in Germany.
What is the figure here?
I think is it
1
point something?
1.4?
Okay.
Yeah. Since Ursula von der Leyen is going up.
What did you say?
What is
Now
the
it's
secret?
decreasing again.
What is the secret of the high birth rate in Israel?
Okay, first of all, there are certain secrets that I can't reveal in this panel, but yeah. So look, interestingly, obviously we have in Israel it is divided into various sectors. So obviously the Arab minority, the high fertility rates, although they're decreasing, they went down from I think about 6 to 3 point something over the past decades, and this is a signal or a parameter that tells us that probably it usually comes along, it correlates well with economic development and so on, and more education and higher access to higher education of the women. At the same time, we have with ultra-Orthodox women, we have the opposite trend, whereby there are more and more an increasing number of or the growth in the fertility rates. But the interesting figure is that also among secular Israelis, I think on Israeli citizens that is, say, not part of those two sectors that I mentioned, the fertility rates are somewhere around 2.7, which is very high. If you compare it to the 1.4 in Germany and low figures in Scandinavia and Italy and so on. And I think, look, it's, I don't think it's a result, I wouldn't associate or try to explain it with government policy that encourages. In the past, we had policies and child subsidies that tried to encourage having kids. I think it's a lot more to do with a cultural issue, cultural expectation. Part of it has to do with some kind of sort of existential fear that still is part of our DNA of, you know, we have to multiply and to overcome the demographic threats and so on. So a lot of it has to do with a sort of national psyche that is translated into a social expectation and so on. I wouldn't really give government policies much credit in as much as fertility rates are concerned. With respect to the other issue that Philip was rating, maybe I'll add, you know, there's room for a lot of synergy. We're quite good at coming up with new ideas, ideas that are generated in Israel in academia. The universities have sort of patent offices that their role is to register those patents and then to come to entrepreneurs and to commercialize them. We have many entrepreneurs, we have many seed investors and angel investors, so there's a very vibrant ecosystem that allows and creates expectations, and a lot of self-confident and sometimes overly confident Israelis that come up with those ideas and innovations, and the results are out there. I think the room of, but there's ample room for cooperation because we're way behind when it comes to building massive and systematic manufacturing lines and taking a product and turning it into mass manufacturing and building worldwide marketing systems and so on. So I think here there's a major synergy between strong idea generation capabilities in Israel and strong manufacturing and marketing and traditions and capabilities in Germany, and everybody can gain from those synergies, common investments, large German industries that can build R&D centers in Israel. Some of these things are already happening. Siemens has a strong presence, other companies, but this can definitely expand to the benefit of all sides. I think that major American international corporations are having strong presence in Israel. If it's Intel, Microsoft, Google, and all of them, some of the greatest inventions of Intel and the other companies came from their Israeli R&D centers. So there's no doubt room for synergy, and I think that the $7 billion in mutual bilateral trade is a small fraction of the actual potential, and it should be our role to create incentives and to create an atmosphere and an ecosystem that will help this figure grow dramatically. And I don't know which number to put for the 2025 vision, but it should definitely be much greater than 7 billion.
Thanks. So, yeah, I got signs that time is running out. Nevertheless, I would like to do, pardon? Has run out, okay. So then no final statements here. Is that okay for everyone? Yeah? I think we had a really interesting conversation about the future of German-Israeli relations in 2025, and I think David Zur already named it when he said his dream is that in 2025 there will be an end to the conflict with the Palestinians, and I think we can add that we hope that the relationship between both countries will be as good and intensive and friendly as they are today. So thank you very much, and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Den ich, wenn ich das hier so offen sagen darf, für einen der klügsten außenpolitischen Beobachter Israels und überhaupt nicht nur der Außenpolitik Israels halte. Schön, dass Sie da sein können, freut mich sehr. Zu meiner Rechten Gerd, ja genau, das ist verdient. Zu meiner Rechten Gerd Weißkirchen, der außenpolitische Sprecher der SPD-Bundestagsfraktion war, seit langem beim Thema Bekämpfung von Antisemitismus und auch deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen engagiert ist und es auch jetzt ist als Co-Chair von Elnet Deutschland, das jetzt neu gegründet worden ist vor einiger Zeit. Und ganz rechts, was eigentlich wirklich eine Position ist, die überhaupt nicht zu ihm passt. Wir können ja gerade feststellen, dass, ich bleibe jetzt beim Du, Ralf, so schön gesagt in einem der Postings on Facebook zu Rot-Rot-Grün, zwischen Rot und Grün wächst kein Grün, also ich würde dich sonst normalerweise wieder eher in die Mitte platzieren. Ralf Füchs ist Vorsitzender der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung und wie ich finde auch hier in Lob eine der interessantesten Stiftungen mit in Berlin, wobei wir natürlich nur interessante politische Stiftungen in Berlin haben, das ist vollkommen klar, und auch seit langem sehr engagiert im Thema deutsch-israelische Beziehungen. Wir haben ja ein ganz klares Thema innerhalb der deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen. Und wenn wir uns die angucken, können wir sagen, es gibt da zwei Schienen, die manchmal nicht so recht miteinander vereinbar sind. Das eine ist das, was ich nenne, die Verpflichtungsgedenkschiene, die wir gerade um Tage wie den 9. November immer so ein bisschen bekommen, von denen ich mittlerweile das Gefühl habe, dass da mehr Lippenbekenntnis ist als echtes Verständnis für die politisch und auch militärisch prekäre Situation, in der sich Israel zumal in diesem sich wandelnden Umfeld befindet. Und die andere Ebene, die politisch-operative Ebene, wie es immer so schön heißt, auf der eigentlich sehr viel klappt. Wir haben Kabinettstreffen, wir haben einen großen Wissenschaftsaustausch oder so, aber der fehlt eigentlich der gesellschaftliche Unterbau. Ich würde mal sagen, dass wir das, was wir eigentlich wünschen würden für bilaterale Beziehungen, dass sie in ihrem Kern auch von einer breiten Mehrheit in der Gesellschaft getragen werden. Ich glaube nicht, dass wir davon in den deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen sprechen können. Das, was ich so ein bisschen als Brücke dazu verstanden habe, war die Rede, die Bundeskanzlerin Merkel vor der Knesset gehalten hat und in der sie erklärt hat, Israels Sicherheit gehöre zur Staatsräson. Ich habe das so ein bisschen verstanden als Brücke zwischen den beiden Dingen. Auf der einen Seite die Verpflichtung, die aus der Geschichte erwächst, aber die soll sich auch im täglichen operativen Geschäft mit Israel äußern. Shlomo Avineri, als erstes die Frage an Sie. Israel hat ja eigentlich immer darauf geachtet, dass es in zumal in militärischen und nicht nur in politischen Sicherheitsangelegenheiten aus eigener Kraft handeln kann. Das betrifft sogar deren große Verbündete, die Amerikaner. Gibt es denn irgendetwas auf diesem Sektor von wegen Sicherheits- ist Staatsräson für Deutschland, das Israel von Deutschland wirklich und wahrhaftig erwartet?
Die einfache Antwort ist ja. Staatsräson, ich erlaube mir da einen Kommentar zu diesem Wort der Bundeskanzlerin zuzufügen. Wenn man das Wort Staatsräson speziell auf Deutsch hört, denkt man meistens an Bismarck. Staatsräson, Realismus, Machiavellismus, wenn nicht sogar Zynizismus. Eigentlich, soweit wie ich das Wort verstehe, Staatsräson ist nicht nur Realismus, Staatsräson hat auch eine moralische Komponente. Wenn man von Staatsräson, der eigenen Staatsräson spricht, spricht man nicht nur von Interessen, sondern auch Recht auf Leben, Recht auf gutes Leben, Recht auf Sicherheit. Und das sind moralische und nicht nur realistische Elemente. So dass das Wort, ich weiß, das ist manchmal problematisch, speziell wenn es auf Deutsch gesagt wird, ist nicht nur Realismus und nicht nur harte Macht, sondern auch eine moralische Verpflichtung. Und in diesem Sinne glaube ich, dass man von Israels Seite, von Deutschland 2 Elemente sich versprechen möchte. Erstens Realismus und nicht politische Korrektheit. Und ich will da 2 Beispiele geben. Realismus. Erstens im Friedensprozess zwischen Israel und Palästinensern und zweitens, was sich jetzt im Nahosten, in der arabischen Welt abspielt. Realismus. Ich bin der Meinung, dass es sehr gut wird für Israelis, für Palästinenser, für den Frieden der Welt und der Region, wenn Israel und die Palästinenser ein Final Status Agreement erreichen werden. Ich habe gehört, was hier Tzipi Livni gesagt hat, das sagt sie ja auch jeden Tag in Israel und ich teile ihre Hoffnung. Aber ich erlaube mir einen bestimmten Skeptizismus. Und der Skeptizismus ist, dass auch wenn es nicht zu einem Abkommen kommen wird, und die Tatsache ist, dass die Regierung, die Olmert-Tzipi Livni-Regierung vor 5 Jahren 2 Jahre lang mit den Palästinensern verhandelt hat und kein Abkommen davon gekommen ist. Ich bin nicht sicher, dass in der jetzigen Situation mit einer jetzigen israelischen Regierung, mit der Spaltung zwischen Westbank und Gaza, eine Möglichkeit für eine Final Status Agreement möglich ist.
Aber wo sind die Deutschen da?
Einen Moment. Da kommen die Deutschen rein. Wenn man, wie es heute politisch korrekt ist in der EU, davon denkt, dass entweder wird es zu einem Abkommen kommen oder hat man Chaos oder wie sogar John Kerry sagte, eine neue Intifada, ist das ein binarisches Denken und es gibt auch immer andere Möglichkeiten. Unser Konflikt im Nahosten ist ähnlich zum Konflikt auf Zypern, Kosovo, Bosnien, Kaschmir, wo in keinem von diesen Fällen ein endgültiges Resultat durch Verhandlungen erreicht wurde. Aber die Alternative ist nicht immer Chaos, die Alternative kann sein. Und ich glaube, da kann Deutschland Realismus in die Diskussion bringen können, dass, wenn es nicht zu einem Abkommen kann man doch über Teilabkommen denken, über stufenweise Abkommen, über einseitigen Schritte von israelischer Seite wie auch von palästinensischer Seite. Die Alternative ist nicht ja oder ist nicht entweder oder, es gibt immer andere Alternativen und ich glaube, dass man da von Deutschland, weil Deutschland so einflussreich in der Europäischen Union ist, auch weil Deutschland in anderen Fällen eine realistische und nicht nur eine politische korrekte Einstellung hat, dass man da von Deutschland etwas sich vorstellen kann, dass Deutschland da etwas mehr differenzierten denkt, als man manchmal in Brüssel denkt. Es ist nicht entweder oder. Zweitens.
Merken Sie sich bitte mal kurz das Zweitens, weil ich würde gerne an dieser Stelle schon mal fragen, wie weit von diesem Realismus tatsächlich umsetzbar ist. Denn wenn ich mir das angucke, Ralf Füchs und Gerd Weißkirchen, vielleicht Gerd Weißkirchen Sie zuerst, der Realismus, der darin besteht, dass wir nicht eine absolute endgültige Lösung für Nahost haben, die die Grenzen richtig ziehen, den Konflikt beendet, sondern sagt, unter Umständen gehen in der nächsten Zeit mal Teillösungen. Ist das etwas, was einer deutschen Gesellschaft tatsächlich verkauft werden kann? Kann es nicht auch sein, dass eine Regierung da auch etwas, gerade auf europäischer Ebene, etwas getrieben ist von dem, was eigentlich an Erwartungshaltung ist, die da heißt, wir haben es doch bis hierher mit dem Konflikt. Wir können ihn doch alle nicht mehr aushalten. Wir wissen doch eigentlich gar nicht genau, warum der immer nicht gelöst wird. Zumal wir auch langsam so ein bisschen die Richtung entwickeln, dass wir sowieso eine Partei ausmachen, die dann der Bremser ist. Im Augenblick wird das Israel gesehen. Ist der Realismus etwas, den Deutschland tatsächlich, nein, sagen wir auf 2 Ebenen, eine deutsche Regierung wirklich annehmen kann, auf der europäischen Ebene vertreten kann und einer generellen Öffentlichkeit verkaufen kann?
Frage an Gerd oder an mich?
Gerd zuerst und an Ralf gerne.
Ich glaube, das wird sogar die Pflicht sein der Bundesregierung und der politischen Elite in Deutschland, der deutschen Öffentlichkeit genau das zu erklären. Weil wir werden davon ausgehen müssen, ob wir es wollen oder nicht, dass der Prozess, der hinführt zur Zwei-Staaten-Lösung, ein höchst schlingernder, gefährdeter, auch von Rückfällen möglicherweise auch Seitenlinien gefährdeter Prozess ist. Und deswegen wäre es wichtig, wenn die deutsche Regierung sich darüber im Klaren wäre, meiner Meinung nach ist sie es längst, dass das ein ganz heikler, schwieriger Schritt werden wird oder eine Folge von Schritten. Das Problem ist nur, dass, und jetzt komme ich zu dem, was Shlomo aufgeworfen hat, zur Frage Political Correctness. Die Frage ist für mich nicht, ob die Bundesregierung das so akzeptieren würde, das würde sie. Aber sie muss mehr tun, als sich im Geflecht der politischen Correctness sich zu bewegen. Sie muss dann auch erklären. Und man kann nur etwas erklären, einen schwierigen, heiklen, von Rückfällen bedrohten Prozess erklären, wenn es eine Grundlinie gibt, an der sich die Bundesregierung auch wirklich im Konfliktfall, auch wenn es schlingert, hält.
Wir hatten 3 Bundesregierungen, die Afghanistan schon nicht gut erklären kann. Kann sie das, Ralf?
Ja, das ist ja nicht nur eine Frage der Erklärung. Ich finde es schon politisch weise, nicht alles auf ein finales Abkommen zu setzen, das innerhalb von 9 Monaten, Kerry sagt, da ist die Hälfte schon fast abgelaufen, erzielt werden muss, sondern einen Plan B zu haben. Und unter unseren Freunden, sowohl in Israel und Palästina, wird diese Frage immer kontrovers diskutiert von Partial Agreements, von praktischer Kooperation unterhalb einer Zwei-Staaten-Lösung, von Teilrückzug der israelischen Armee, Erleichterung der Freizügigkeit der Palästinenser, bessere Handelsmöglichkeiten, also alles Dinge, die das Leben der Palästinenserinnen und Palästinenser verbessern könnten. Aber die Befürchtung auf der palästinensischen Seite ist natürlich, dass von Israel aus jedes Partial Agreement als Final Agreement behandelt wird und damit sagen, auf unabsehbare Zeit der Status quo festgefroren wird und dass Israel weiter Facts on the Ground schafft. Also die Frage der Siedlungen ist extrem kritisch für das Zutrauen, dass möglicherweise provisorische Übereinkünfte dann zu einem tragfähigen Frieden und einem territorialen Kompromiss zwischen beiden führen können. Das andere ist die innenpolitische Stimmung in Deutschland, von Europa ganz abgesehen. Und ich finde, wir dürfen uns da gar nichts schönreden. Meine Sorge ist, wenn der jetzige Verhandlungsprozess zusammenbrechen sollte, ohne Ergebnis, dass wir eine enorme Zunahme der Stimmung sehen werden, mehr Druck auf Israel in Richtung Sanktionen und Boykott. In Europa sowieso. Es gibt nur wenige Länder, die im Grunde noch eine klare Haltung da gegenüber Israel haben in Europa. Und ich sehe unter der Oberfläche der offiziellen freundschaftlichen Beziehungen doch eine zunehmende Drift. Eher eine wachsende Entfernung als ein wachsendes Verständnis füreinander.
Das heißt, in der Konsequenz müsste wahrscheinlich auch in Israel deutlich werden, dass der Realismus, den Sie einfordern, ein bisschen was erfordert, was von Israel kommen wird. Aber ich habe Sie rüde unterbrochen, jetzt kommt Punkt 2. Was kommt als zweites?
Noch ein Wort dafür. Niemand heute in Europa denkt ernst, wie man Zypern lösen kann oder wie man Kosovo und Mitrovica lösen kann. Und wenn man nicht eine Antwort auf Mitrovica hat und Nikosia, ist es eine große Chutzpe, wenn man glaubt, man hat eine gute Antwort aus Europa über Jerusalem. Ich glaube, da muss man realistisch sein. Danke für den Beifall, aber das heißt nicht, dass die israelische Position über Jerusalem die einzige absolute Position sein soll. Aber man soll uns nicht predigen, wenn man in Europa, in Nikosia und Mitrovica keine Lösungen finden kann oder in Bosnien. Das ist das Erste. Zweitens, das zweite Problem ist Illusionen über was sich jetzt im Nahosten abspielt, in der arabischen Welt. Ich glaube, vor 2,5 Jahren war die Political Correctness in Europa, teilweise auch in Israel, auch in Amerika, dass jetzt im Nahosten etwas ähnlich geschieht, wie es 1998, 90 in Mittel- und Osteuropa geschehen wird. Das ist der Frühling, der arabische Frühling, 1848, 1989, dass der Weg in Ägypten und in Libyen und vielleicht auch in Syrien von Diktatur und Erpressung zu Demokratie und Toleranz ein einfacher Weg ist. Und wir wissen, dass das nicht ein einfacher Weg ist, weil wir auch in Mittel- und Osteuropa komplizierte Situationen sehen. Polen und die Tschechische Republik und sogar Ungarn mit den jetzigen Problemen ist eine andere Geschichte als Russland. Weil man muss fragen, wo ist die Zivilgesellschaft? Was sind die sozialen und wirtschaftlichen Grundlagen von einem guten Übergang zur Demokratie? Und wenn man sich Ägypten anschaut, und ich bin kein großer Unterstützer der jetzigen Militärdiktatur in Ägypten oder wie man es nun nennt, aber wenn man ein Land wie Ägypten sich anschaut, darf man sich nicht nur beeindrucken von den halben Millionen Leuten, die im Tahrir Square demonstrieren und die Englisch sprechen und Facebook-Accounts haben und so weiter. Das ist nicht Ägypten. In Ägypten gibt es 85 Millionen Leute, die nicht nur keinen Facebook-Account haben, sie haben sogar viele von denen keine Elektrizität und reines Wasser. Das ist Ägypten. Und in Ägypten gibt es zwei, wenn die stärkste wirtschaftliche oder gesellschaftliche Gruppe in Ägypten einerseits das Militär ist, das eine historische Identität Ägypten ist. Das ist auch ein Teil der ägyptischen Situation. Und dann auf der anderen Seite die Moslem-Brüderschaft. Wenn das sind die stärksten Gruppen in der Gesellschaft, kann man nicht denken, dass man da innerhalb 1 oder 2 Jahren eine fungierte Demokratie haben wird. Die Alternative ist etwas irgendwie zwischen einem mehr liberalen, autoritären System, das langsam sich entwickelt zu einer offenen Gesellschaft, zu einer toleranten Gesellschaft. Doch auch in Europa war nach der Französischen Revolution nicht die Demokratie gleich zur Tagesordnung gekommen. Frankreich hat es gedauert 150 Jahre. Und die Demokratie in Frankreich ist durch einen Putsch, durch einen Militärputsch von de Gaulle, das vergisst man heute, das ist nicht political correctness zu sagen. Da muss man auch realistisch sein, was sich in der arabischen Welt abspielt. Da darf man sich nicht Illusionen machen, dass da Dinge über Nacht sich ändern werden. Und ich bin nicht der Meinung, dass was sich heute in Ägypten oder sogar in Syrien abspielt, eine Gefahr für Israel ist oder eine Gefahr für die Welt. Das ist eine Gefahr für die arabische Welt, die nicht über Nacht von einem jahrhundertlangen System der Unterdrückung und der Autorität in etwas Neues kommt. Und noch ein Wort dazu. Im Westen denkt man meistens, dass Säkularisierung mit Demokratie, Liberalismus und Toleranz verbunden sind. Wir sehen das im Nahosten. Säkularisierung wurde immer aufoktroyiert von autoritären Regimes. Der Schah in Persien, in Iran, Atatürk in der Türkei, Mubarak in einer sanften Art, Saddam Hussein und Assad in einer nicht so sanften Art. Im Nahosten Säkularisierung gleicht autoritäre Regimes. Vox Populi ist manchmal die Muslim Brotherhood. Da muss man verstehen, dass die geschichtliche Entwicklung im Nahosten nicht dieselbe ist wie im Westen, nicht, dass die Ziele nicht dieselben sein können, aber da muss man den Pluralismus anerkennen und nicht europäische Modelle auf eine nicht-europäische Gesellschaft aufzuoktroyieren und dann bekommt man dann die jetzige Enttäuschung. Die Enttäuschung ist nicht im Platz, so wie der Enthusiasmus am Anfang nicht im Platz war. Da muss man sehr realistisch sein und wieder Deutschland mit der historischen Entwicklung in Deutschland, in der Bundesrepublik, auch was dann später nach dem Fall der Mauer in dem Vereinigten Deutschland geschah. Deutschland ist, glaube ich, in einer besseren Situation, diesen Realismus zu erkennen und danach auch zu handeln.
Aber in der Konsequenz heißt es, ein Realismus, den Sie einklagen, der da heißt, die generelle Situation Israels im Nahen Ostens, hat sich nicht so verändert, dass es bessere Voraussetzungen schafft, um jetzt beispielsweise umfassende Abkommen zu treffen, sondern die Situation ist im Zweifelsfall noch prekärer geworden? Oder zu welchem Behufe ist dieser Realismus? Dient er einfach nur der Erkenntnis oder hat er eine politische Konsequenz?
Da liegt ein Paradox. Als die Entwicklung in der arabischen Welt im ersten Stadium, das sehr positiv aussah, da waren in Israel zwei Meinungen. Die eine Meinung war, jetzt ändert sich alles im Nahosten, dann haben wir auch eine gute Chance. Und da gab es die andere Meinung, naja, wenn alles nicht mehr stabil ist, darf man sich nichts tun. Beide Seiten haben Unrecht. Die Tatsache ist, dass die jetzigen Verhandlungen zwischen Israel und den Palästinensern nicht tangiert wurde, von was sich in der Umgebung geht. Die Differenzen zwischen Israel und den Palästinensern sind dieselben Differenzen. Sie wurden nicht leichter, sie wurden nicht schwieriger. Wir haben da etwas Bilaterales, Palästinenser und wir zu verhandeln. Und paradoxerweise, was sich in Syrien und Ägypten abspielt, hat keinen großen Einfluss auf die Positionen weder der Palästinenser noch der Israelis. Ich weiß, das klingt paradox, aber ich glaube, das ist realistisch.
Ich will mal was aufnehmen, was im vorhergehenden Panel gefallen ist. Herr Missfelder, dem ich natürlich nur ungern widersprechen möchte, wenn er die Kanzlerin lobt, wer möchte das schon, meinte, alle Kanzler würden eine Sicherheitspartnerschaft unterstützen. Und ich frage mich, ob das tatsächlich so ist. Shlomo Avineri hat gerade bei dem, was von Israel gefordert ist, zwei sehr politische Faktoren genannt. Keine sicherheitspolitischen, keine militärischen. Aber jetzt nehmen wir doch mal den Fall her, dass Iran sich tatsächlich so in eine solche Verhandlungsposition bringt, und ich halte es für die wahrscheinlichste, dass sie die Fähigkeiten haben, sozusagen short-off zu sein. Das heißt, sie haben in kürzester Zeit nukleare Kapazitäten, weil sie haben eigentlich alles, was man braucht. Und trotzdem machen wir einen Deal mit ihnen, wir werden die Sanktionen verringern, weil wir Interesse daran haben. Heißt aber auch in der Konsequenz, dass Israel durch sich selbst, aber auch durch Unterstützung in die Lage versetzt werden muss, ein Abschreckungspotenzial zu haben. Jetzt erinnere ich mich mal kurz dran an die Lieferung von U-Booten, die Israel in die Situation einer Zweitschlagskapazität versetzen, die nicht von seinem eigenen Territorium ausgehen müssen. Denn im Falle von einem Atomkrieg, den wir uns natürlich alle, das wäre ein Horrorszenario natürlich, muss Israel in der Situation sein, Abschreckung außerhalb seines Territoriums zu haben. Deswegen ja die U-Boote. Und wir erinnern uns daran, wie Günter Grass mit seinem Gedicht darauf reagiert hat und wie hoch die Zustimmung in der breiten Öffentlichkeit dazu gewesen ist. Nicht beim Kommentariat, erstaunlicherweise, aber unter all den, also in der Öffentlichkeit, unter all dem, was man in den Kommentarspalten findet, von denen ich immer hoffe, dass es Internet-Trolle sind. Aber Ralf Füchs, nochmal die Frage, Deutschland ist ja nun ein Land, das aus dem Pazifismus eine politische Kultur gemacht hat in den vergangenen 60 Jahren, das aus den Lehren, die man aus Auschwitz ziehen kann, nur die Lehre nie wieder Krieg gezogen hat. Die Grünen haben da andere Erfahrungen, die haben die ersten Auslandseinsätze mitmachen und auch tragen müssen, aber die haben natürlich auch eine Basis, die das nicht hat. Wären wir denn in der Lage, hätten wir eine politische Elite, die tatsächlich willens wäre, Israel auch, Staatsräson, Sicherheit Israels ist unsere Staatsräson, im Zweifelsfall nicht mal militärisch zu unterstützen, ich glaube, da könnten die Israelis ganz gut darauf verzichten, sondern auch militärisch oder waffentechnologisch mit zu unterstützen? Oder würde das nicht fast alle Parteien im Bundestag und auch sonst in der politischen Debatte da draußen in der Öffentlichkeit an den Rand der Zerfetzung bringen?
Man muss ja braucht ja nur ein bisschen in die jüngere Geschichte zurückzublicken, um zu sehen, auf welch dünnem Eis diese Garantie der Bundeskanzlerin sich bewegt, wenn sie sagte, die Sicherheit, das Existenzrecht Israels ist deutsche Staatsräson. Das enthält ja im Grunde ein hartes Beistandsversprechen, wenn es ernst gemeint ist. Es ist ein hartes Beistandsversprechen. Jetzt erinnert man sich, das kam ja in den letzten Monaten, weil sich das gerade 40 Jahre jährte, wieder hoch an die Haltung der damaligen deutschen Bundesregierung unter Willy Brandt während des Yom Kippur-Krieges. Ja? Also wo die Bundesregierung ursprünglich nicht bereit war, zuzustimmen, dass amerikanische Rüstungstransporte für Israel, die damals überlebenswichtig waren, in einer Situation, wo Israel militärisch mit dem Rücken zur Wand stand, dass die über die amerikanischen Stützpunkte in Deutschland transportiert werden sollten. Warum? Weil man es sich mit der arabischen Welt nicht verderben wollte, Stichwort Ölinteressen. Dieses Stichwort fiel damals explizit in entsprechenden Vermerken aus dem Auswärtigen Amt und dem Kanzleramt. Und ich kann mich noch gut daran erinnern, wie das war beim ersten Irakkrieg, 1992, als die Auseinandersetzung um die Lieferung von Patriot-Raketen an Israel ging, also um Flugabwehrraketen. Da waren wir innerhalb der Grünen eine kleine Minderheit, die das offensiv vertreten haben, aber auch in der Gesellschaft war das höchst kontrovers. Ja? Das hat, glaube ich, mit mehreren Dingen zu tun. Einerseits mit sehr unterschiedlichen sicherheitspolitischen Kulturen und Mentalitäten. In Israel eben sehr stark sowohl historisch bedingt wie aufgrund der tatsächlichen realpolitischen Situation in der Region eine ausgeprägte Wehrhaftigkeit als Rückversicherung, während wir ja eine Zeit lang dachten, wir wären bereits im Zeitalter des ewigen Friedens angekommen und Kategorien wie Rüstung und Abschreckung wären Anachronismus. Ja, da gibt es eine Ungleichzeitigkeit im gesellschaftlichen Denken, aber ich sehe auch in Deutschland eine Entwicklung, die mehr und mehr sagt, wir müssen unsere Politik gegenüber Israel nicht aus der Geschichte heraus begründen, also dieses historische Sonderverhältnis, das aus dem Holocaust kommt, sondern wir müssen unsere Haltung gegenüber Israel nach unseren Interessen definieren. Also da gibt es meines Erachtens eine schleichende Verschiebung und ich habe diese Äußerung von Frau Merkel vor der Knesset fast als eine Art, als ob sie einen Pflock einschlagen wollte im Treibsand. Ja, während in Wirklichkeit die Bereitschaft, Risiken für Israel einzugehen, meines Erachtens eher zurückgeht in der Bundesrepublik, hat sie versucht, da eine klare Linie zu ziehen mit dem Begriff der Staatsräson. Ob das tatsächlich halten würde, wenn es ernst auf ernst kommt, da bin ich mir gar nicht sicher. Ich glaube, ein Probefall, und zwar ein realpolitischer Probefall, könnte sein, ob die Bundesrepublik bereit wäre, sich zu beteiligen an internationalen Sicherheitsgarantien im Rahmen einer Zwei-Staaten-Lösung. Ich bin überzeugt davon, dass es ohne solche Garantien sehr schwer wird, zu einer solchen Regelung zu kommen, weil die Palästinenser darauf bestehen werden, dass die IDF sich zurückzieht aus der Westbank, dass es sich auch zurückzieht aus dem Jordantal, dass es nicht eine permanente militärische Interventionsmöglichkeit Israels gibt aus Sicherheitsinteressen. Und dann ist die Frage, gibt es zusätzliche Sicherheitsgarantien, und zwar belastbare Sicherheitsgarantien für Israel, die von verbündeten Staaten garantiert werden müssten. Und ich bin gespannt darauf. Es gibt solche Vorschläge, an denen wir auch beteiligt sind, also sie auszuarbeiten, ob es dafür eine ernsthafte Bereitschaft geben wird. Ich hoffe es.
Gerd Weiskirchen, wenn ich jetzt ganz gemein wäre, würde ich natürlich noch mal erwähnen, dass derjenige, der die Lieferung der U-Boote am meisten kritisiert hat, ein SPD-Mitglied war, aber Gott sei Dank bin ich nicht so gemein. Aber trotzdem, auch die gleiche Frage, was wäre denn tatsächlich, wenn es hart auf hart käme, wie Ralf Füchs sagen würde. Und jenseits der fast noch bescheidenen Anforderungen von Shlomo Avineri nach hauptsächlich politischer Schützenhilfe, die mehr in Verständnis und daraus Aktionen geht, was wäre denn tatsächlich möglich, wenn es hart auf hart käme?
Also wenn es hart auf hart käme, dann muss das, was die Frau Bundeskanzlerin gesagt hat, auch real eingelöst werden. Weil wenn es nicht real eingelöst wird, dann wäre es eine rhetorische Floskel, ein Ornament, das in dem Moment, wo die Sicherheitsinteressen Israels auf dem Spiel stehen, derjenige, der sich erklärt hat, dass er die Sicherheitsinteressen Israels zu schützen bereit ist, davonläuft. Und das kann eine deutsche Bundesregierung nicht tun. Und sie kann es aus 3 Gründen nicht tun. Wir sollen nicht mehr über die Vergangenheit reden, pardon, aber sie muss es aus Vergangenheitsgründen tun. Zweitens, sie muss es aus Gegenwartsgründen tun. Denn was ist, wenn Israel in einem Maße gefährdet wäre, denn davon muss man im Worst Case ja ausgehen, dass Iran so stark wäre oder andere, dass Israel von der Landkarte gestrichen würde, was ja diejenigen, die das so rhetorisch behaupten, auch wollen. Was wäre denn dann mit dem Mittelmeerraum? Was wäre denn dann mit einer möglichen positiven Entwicklung? Ich rede nicht von Euphorie. Dort, in unserer direkten Nachbarschaft. Denn die Sicherheitslage Israels ist nicht irgendeine Sicherheitslage, sondern sie trifft uns selbst ins Herz und ins Mark. Das heißt, es ist eine Gegenwartsaufgabe. Und das Letzte und das Dritte ist die Zukunftserwartung. Was wäre denn, wenn an diesem Punkt der Iran sich vollständig durchsetzen würde mit der Zukunft unserer Welt und unserer Region, in der wir hier leben? Also wenn man diese 3 Fragen positiv beantworten will, und man muss sie positiv beantworten, dann darf das Wort der Staatsräson nicht eine leere Floskel sein, sondern sie muss Realitätsgehalt gewinnen, dann, wenn es darauf ankommt. Und ich habe das gesagt, Frau Tempel, als ich gefragt worden bin von einem Journalist des Economist, es war 2006 oder 2007, als wir eine ähnliche schwierige Situation hatten, was würdest du denn machen? Denn das muss man ja immer direkt fragen. Wenn es zu dieser Situation käme, da habe ich gesagt, und dabei bleibe ich würde nicht mit einem Augenwimper zucken, wenn es darauf ankäme, alles zu tun, dass die Sicherheitsinteressen Israels gewahrt bleiben. Das würde auch bedeuten, militärische Konsequenzen für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland wie im Kosovo und anderswo. Und von daher gesehen haben wir jetzt eine andere qualitative Entwicklung, als es zuvor der Fall war. Und schon aus diesem Grunde meine ich, wenn wir jetzt eine neue Bundesregierung haben, dann muss dieses Wort der Staatsräson innerhalb der Regierungskoalition einen festen Platz haben, unverrückbar.
Nochmal zurückgefragt, bevor ich zu Shlomo Avineri gleich zurückgehe, den ich gerne nochmal befragen würde, wie weit er tatsächlich dieses militärische Engagement von israelischer Seite aus erwartet. Überhöhen wir die Debatte damit nicht ein bisschen? Wenn wir es nämlich auf den Punkt zurückbringen, dann handelt es sich bei Vernichtungsdrohungen gegen Israel nicht einfach nur um Sachen, die unsere eigene Gesellschaft betreffen, vergangenheitspolitisch, sondern es geht um einen Skandalon der internationalen Politik. Ein Staat, der eine völkerrechtliche Legitimierung hat, die im Grunde genommen sauberer ist als die manch eines anderen neu gegründeten Staates, wird mit Vernichtung bedroht. Das ist etwas, was man auf internationaler Ebene, egal ob es sich um den jüdischen Staat handelt, da ist es noch ein besonderes Skandalon, aber egal um welchen Staat es sich handelt, generell ein Skandalon. Warum regt uns eigentlich diese Grundtatsache so wenig auf? Warum müssen wir es überhaupt so überhöhen, um es zur Kenntnis zu nehmen? Gibt es da eine Antwort drauf, Herr Füchs?
Ja, was heißt ja uns? Ich meine, uns regt es ja auf. Es regt eben
das ist aber die generelle Gesellschaft, die anderen.
Es regt eben noch nicht alle auf. Also ich spiele ja hier so ein bisschen jetzt eine andere Rolle. Ja, du machst den Appell, der ist auch gut, den teile ich auch. Ich versuche ja ein bisschen Wasser in den Wein zu gießen im Sinne einer nüchternen Analyse, wie sich das deutsch-israelische Verhältnis tatsächlich entwickelt. Und da mache ich mir eher Sorgen. Ja, also deshalb sind nämlich gerade solche Appelle nötig, wie du sie hier lancierst, weil ich beobachte, dass diese selbstverständliche Empathie, dieses Gefühl, right or wrong, Israel ist unser Partner und das ist ein Land, dem gegenüber wir eine besondere Verpflichtung haben. Und zwar unabhängig davon, ob wir mit der Politik der israelischen Regierung glücklich sind oder nicht.
Das sollte sich von selbst verstehen.
Das ist genau das Problem, ja, dass ich sage, es gibt eine grundlegende Solidarität mit und Empathie für Israel, unabhängig von der Politik der israelischen Regierung. Dieses Gefühl schwindet meines Erachtens.
Wenn es überhaupt
in der
noch vorhanden ist.
Dieses Gefühl schwindet meines Erachtens in der Bundesrepublik. Und wenn du es realpolitisch durchbuchstabierst, dann gibt es natürlich, das sieht man jetzt an der amerikanischen Politik, die fast um jeden Preis ein Abkommen mit dem Iran haben möchte, weil sie natürlich zahlreiche Interessen hat, die mit dem Iran direkt oder indirekt zusammenhängen. Afghanistan, Syrien, auch ökonomische Interessen der Stabilisierung des Golfs. Das heißt, realpolitisch fürchte ich, dass Israel zunehmend ins Abseits driften wird, wenn die jetzigen Verhandlungen scheitern. Damit muss man sich ernsthaft überlegen, wie man damit umgeht.
Gerd, einen Satz dazu?
Wenn ich darf. Ich finde, hier muss jetzt das Problem, das es in Deutschland gibt, offen angesprochen werden. Du hast das sehr vorsichtig angedeutet. Wir haben ein politisches Commitment der politischen Elite. Man kann es auch Political Correctness nennen. Und das eigentliche Problem der deutschen Gesellschaft ist, das fand ich sehr schön, was Michael Sommer dazu gesagt hat, dass Staatsräson noch nicht Gesellschaftsräson ist. Da sind wir alle gemeinsam in Deutschland aufgefordert, das, was Staatsräson zunächst als formaler Begriff bedeutet, mit Inhalt zu füllen, mit Sympathie, mit Empathie und dafür zu sorgen, dass das unverbrüchlich ist, die Zusammenarbeit und die Zusammengehörigkeit zwischen Deutschen und Juden, zwischen Deutschland und Israel. Das ist unsere gemeinsame gesellschaftliche Aufgabe. Und wenn uns das nicht gelingt, dann wird es schwierig. Und deswegen müssen wir daran mit aller Konsequenz so arbeiten, dass diese Unverbrüchlichkeit auch steht in größeren Konflikten.
Shlomo Avineri, das ist ja, was wir auch hören, eigentlich auch immer eine innergesellschaftliche Debatte, die im Grunde genommen von Minderheit zu Mehrheit geführt wird, zumindest in diesem Fall. Aber jetzt nochmal aus der israelischen Sicht. Ist es wirklich das, was Israel von Deutschland erwarten würde, auch diese Art von militärischem Engagement? Weil Sie haben ja zwei ganz ausgesprochen politische Punkte genannt.
Einer meiner Lehrer sagte mir einmal, antworte niemals hypothetische Fragen. Und das ist eine hypothetische Frage. Aber ich glaube, sie wird verstanden. Ich glaube, eine der wichtigsten Konsequenzen von diesem Statement von der Bundeskanzlerin war, dass es nicht nur in Deutschland und in Israel Widerhall hatte, es hatte auch Widerhall in der arabischen Welt und möglicherweise auch im Iran. Das war wichtig. Auch wenn es nicht spezifisch ist und man darf da niemals spezifische Garantien geben, weil das ist immer gefährlich. Aber ich will da etwas anderes sagen. Ich glaube, die Beziehungen zwischen Deutschland und Israel haben auch zu tun mit einer Wertgemeinschaft. Das wurde auch vorher gesagt hier. Die Wertgemeinschaft zwischen der Europäischen Union, Deutschland auch, und Israel, weil Israel eine Demokratie ist. Das heißt nicht, dass Israel right or wrong, aber wenn ein demokratisches Land sogar Fehler macht, ist es ein demokratisches Land. Und da gibt es eine Empathie und eine Wertgemeinschaft. Zudem möchte ich zusagen, und das werde ich vielleicht etwas in einer vorsichtigen Art und Weise sagen, die Beziehungen mit Israel und die Versöhnung zwischen Deutschland und Juden und Deutschland und Israel ist eine der Bausteine der deutschen Demokratie. Hätte sich Deutschland mit Israel nicht versöhnt, wäre heute scheinbar die Demokratie in Deutschland nicht so stark, wie sie heute ist. Und das ist einer der Bausteine und deshalb auch vielleicht Staatsräson von Deutschland. Die Beziehungen mit Israel sind nicht nur eine historische Verpflichtung, das ist auch eine Verpflichtung vis-à-vis den demokratischen Werten der heutigen Bundesrepublik. Deshalb sind wir ein Teil der nicht nur der deutschen Staatsräson, die Sicherheit Israel, nicht immer die Ansprüche Israel, aber die Sicherheit Israel, wir sind ein Teil der deutschen Demokratie. Und ich glaube, das wird bestimmen auch in der Zukunft die komplizierte Art und Weise, in der die Beziehungen auf Staatsebene und auch Gesellschaftsebene nicht immer einfach sind. Und da muss man immer die in der deutschen Gesellschaft Kritiker an Israel fragen, und wer sind eure Freunde im Nahosten? Die Israelis sind klarerweise, machen Fehler, haben manchmal sogar eine falsche Politik. Das ist auch meine persönliche Meinung manchmal über unsere Politik. Aber das sind Fehler und falsche Politik eines demokratischen Landes. Wer sind eure Freunde? Die Islamische Republik in Iran, die Assad-Regime, das Militär oder die Islamische Brüderschaft in Ägypten. Israel zu kritisieren ist sehr einfach. Die Frage ist, was ist die Alternative im Nahosten? Die Alternative im Nahosten ist das demokratische Israel und deshalb ist Israel und die Sicherheit Israel ein Teil der deutschen Staatsräson, hoffentlich auch der Gesellschaftsräson, nicht nur der Staatsräson. Besten Dank.
Sehen Sie, lieber Shlomo Avneri, bei der Frage, wer sind eure Freunde, fürchte ich, wird in der deutschen Gesellschaft generell, nicht nur im Nahen Osten, werden nicht immer und gerne nur die Demokratien genannt. Das haben wir im Zusammenhang mit den USA auch recht häufig. Es gibt hier immer noch eine seltsame Faszination von autoritären Regimen. Aber wie auch immer, Ralf Höchst, noch ein Wort dazu.
Stimme mit Shlomo sehr überein, dass wir die Zukunft der deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen nicht nur auf die Vergangenheit gründen können. Wir müssen die Erinnerung an diese Vergangenheit als eine moralische Verpflichtung wachhalten, aber wir müssen gleichzeitig konstatieren, dass diese Geschichte zur Geschichte wird, das historisiert. Die Shoah wird historisiert. Das heißt, sie bekommt für die neuen Generationen weniger an emotionaler Bedeutung, über die man sich biografisch fast identifiziert als Deutscher, der mit diesem Gefühl der historischen Verantwortung und der Schuld gegenüber den Juden aufgewachsen ist. Und was kann komplementär dazukommen? Und da stimme ich sehr damit überein, dass man das nicht begründen kann mit Start-up-Nation Israel und dass Israel so erfolgreich ist im Hinblick auf, sagen, neue Technologien. Nein, dieses Verhältnis muss sich gründen als eine Wertegemeinschaft auf gemeinsame demokratische und humanistische Überzeugungen. Das ist dann allerdings auch der Maßstab für Kritik an der israelischen Politik. Zu sagen, wenn uns das verbindet, ja, diese Vorstellung von Menschenrechten, von Bürgerrechten und einer demokratischen politischen Kultur, dann ist das auch der Maßstab für eine legitime Kritik an Fehlentwicklungen in Israel selbst oder in der israelischen Politik gegenüber den Palästinensern. Aber was wir unbedingt vermeiden und ich würde sagen bekämpfen müssen, weil das nämlich das Fundament der deutsch-israelischen Beziehungen zerstört, ist eine Dämonisierung und Delegitimierung Israels in Richtung Apartheidstaat und das Ganze ist eine durch und durch rassistische Gesellschaft, ein Unrechtsstaat. Diese Art von Kritik, die auch in Deutschland an den Universitäten und in bestimmten Milieus durchaus an Fahrt gewinnt, die ist deshalb so gefährlich, weil sie das moralische Fundament der deutsch-israelischen Partnerschaft zerstört und demgegenüber müssen wir eine sehr, sehr klare Haltung beziehen.
Meine Damen, meine Herren, ich glaube, das waren jetzt genau die richtigen Worte für diesen Israelkongress zum Abschluss des Political Lab. Und ich glaube, das umschreibt auch die Aufgabe, die ein bisschen mit dem Titel hier schon verbunden war, Connecting for Tomorrow, aber auch das, was wirklich eine der wesentlichen Aufgaben sein muss, nicht nur dieser Politik, sondern auch der Gesellschaft. Ich bin froh, dass Sie in dieser Deutlichkeit gefallen sind. Ich danke meinen Panelisten und ich danke Ihnen für das Ausharren und Zuhören. Ich wünsche Ihnen noch einen schönen Abend.